Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the effects of the new administration on the U.S. automotive industry. It's a follow-up to a conference that we did 4 years ago with the previous administration. And I think this is around our 81st Automotive Futures Conference. So welcome. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. Our funding for our programs come from our affiliate program, our research, and our 5 annual conferences. These are our affiliate members. We want to thank all of our affiliate members. We always do, because we couldn't put on our conferences without them. So thank you very much. And for this particular conference, we have a special sponsor, S&P Global Mobility. Some of the benefits of being an affiliate: early results research, free attendance for everybody in your company to attend the conferences, either virtually or in person. State of the industry presentations, questions to the people who are affiliates. Special for 2025, 20% discount on classes of U of M Executive Education Program, the Ross School of Business Digital and Open Enrollment Programs. And super special for 2025, all current and future Automotive Futures affiliates receive a 25% tariff discount. So for all of you who are interested in joining, this is a good time to jump in. This is the executive education program that's coming up in September, leading the sustainability transformation. The Ross School is one of our affiliates. It's our U of M connection to what's going on in the university, and also allows us to do our conferences here at the U. And as I said, our sponsor for this particular conference, that's S&P Global Mobility. We have research partners across IT, OEMs, government, NGOs, as well as suppliers and consultants. For 2025, our future of EV charging projects is completed, and we're analyzing that data now. We'll be presenting that at our conference coming up in July. Our EV Evolutions project that tracks EVs in China, the US, and EU, that's on our website, available to everybody. Future of Automotive IT. This year, we're not doing AI in the auto industry. We're doing cybersecurity in the auto industry in September. So we're doing the effects of the new administration of the auto industry, and in November, we'll do our 18th annual Inside China conference. So, as I said, these are particular things that are going on at our different conferences. Our researchers, Kara Alkire, who's online today, she's tracking the Q&A for each of the speakers on the YouTube live stream. Sherry Netler-Eisenbeiser is here working on the conference. These are students who are working with us this year across all our different projects. We also encourage people to join our LinkedIn page. We see we're posting now. We're doing 3 to 5 times a week, so it's very good for us to give out this information that we're getting from our research projects, as well as updates on the conferences. So conference presenters, so we got Mike Hartrick from Automotive Innovators. He's going to be talking about environment and energy policy related to the new administration. Mike Jackson from MEMA is talking about the supplier effects of this. Greg Keolian from a professor of sustainability systems here at U of M. And Guido Vildoso from S&P Global Mobility, give us an economics perspective, and as well as a consumer perspective about what's going on. We'll start with Mike, then we'll do Greg. We'll take a break, about 15 minutes, and then we'll do Mike Jackson and Guido, and then adjourn for lunch. At the end of the conference, we'll have our affiliates, we'll get the presentations, but also a document that Kara puts together that summarizes what goes on in the conference, a very good summary of what's going on during the conference. All attendees get links to the presentations. Those should be up by the end of the week, as well as the video. The agenda, speaker bios, registration list, sponsorship opportunities, affiliate information, upcoming events, all on the, not in the Software Defined Conference website, but in the website for the effects of the new administration website that everyone received via email. But the audience questions and the conference feedback are important. For the audience questions, everybody should have question cards on your tables. If not, Sherry will be putting them out, and you can put those out and give us, she'll pick those up in between speakers, and we'll use those for the Q&As. But also, Kara is feeding the questions that come in online through the live stream. So feel free to add your questions in. Conference feedback will send you an email at the end of the conference asking you what you thought, and we went good and bad news. We can accept both. Thank you. As a lead-in, as kind of a setup for our speakers, let me go over some things that we want to talk about. When you look at the difference 7 months makes, 7 months ago we had it from an automotive perspective. We've moved from an industrial policy that focused on providing funding for companies over a 10-year time frame. They were building EV factories in the U.S. They were building computer chip factories in the U.S. Current companies, they were funding current companies to retool their facilities to support the transition to EVs. There was new mining and processing companies opening up in the U.S. New computer chip factories are being built. And while they were still putting high tariffs on Chinese vehicles to delay their entry into the U.S., they were providing financial incentives to consumers to purchase EVs, while providing funding for rebuilding roads and bridges and providing funding for EV charging infrastructure. And today, from an automotive perspective, the industrial policy focuses on companies coming back or bringing back to as much manufacturing capacity as possible to the U.S. from both manufacturers and suppliers. They're negotiating new trade agreements with every country that imports vehicles or components to the U.S., with some leeway for the USMCA agreements. Redesigning the CHIPS Act, it sounds like, about bringing new computer chip factories to the U.S. and putting even higher tariffs on Chinese vehicles and components, while continuing funding for rebuilding roads and bridges, question mark there. From a vehicle perspective, the policies eliminate all of the EV incentives for companies to transition facilities, build in the U.S., build charging stations, and for consumers to buy EVs, with a pivot to deregulation in favor of internal combustion engines. When you look at the tariff challenges, and this is from our colleagues at S&P Global Mobility, you can see the percentage of U.S. sales imported. And this kind of gives you a sense of which companies are probably most exposed to tariffs. So U.S. imported about 45% of light-duty vehicles sold in the U.S. in 2024, including imports from Canada and Mexico, and about 23% of that 45% were imported from outside of North America. When you look at the USMCA trading story, when you compare U.S. imports and U.S. exports from Mexico and Canada and the rest of the world, you're seeing pretty even distribution, and a little difference for motor vehicle bodies and parts from U.S. imports and U.S. exports. But it shows you that how much the USMCA has actually been in effect, and how manufacturers and suppliers have made decisions based on this over the last 5 years. One of the other things that have come up is the tariff stacking story. Our colleagues from the Center for Strategic and International Studies give here some examples of some of the tariffs stacking that is currently in place for Germany, Japan, and South Korea. And my understanding is that it's not as big a deal for the USMCA, but they have their own issues. One of the things that we've talked about in these conferences for a long time had to do with parts tourism. And tariffs really play a huge role in here. And here's an example of a Michigan circuit board manufacturer buying a capacitor from a company in Colorado, which imports it from Asia, sends it to Mexico and El Paso for things to be done there, then sent to another place in Mexico, and finally back to the U.S. And as you can imagine, the tariffs on this kind of situation are an issue. So it's kind of one of the things that we've been talking about for quite a while, really. When you look at the different scenarios, and I think this is one of the things that we kind of want to focus on throughout the conference today. There's a lot of different scenarios across different domains. When you look at the tariff scenarios, one is that manufacturers and suppliers, they don't make any changes and they just absorb the tariffs. Another one is that the manufacturers and suppliers keep current footprints, but shift some production to the U.S. Manufacturers and suppliers build new plants in the U.S. and shift some production. Each manufacturer and supplier makes its own deal with the administration in terms of tariffs. Some manufacturer and supplier associations negotiate for all the manufacturers and suppliers. North American manufacturers and suppliers try to renegotiate the USMCA instead of the current country-by-country negotiation. Foreign manufacturers and suppliers rely on their home countries to negotiate for them. Or companies collaborate on manufacturing and components to avoid tariffs. So some of the, I think this is true for some of the Japanese manufacturers. They're considering doing some joint manufacturing. So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about and talking about in terms of tariff scenarios. Now let's look at the regulatory scenarios. And these are not, none of these are mutually exclusive, right? So the regulatory scenarios can also overlap with what's going on with the tariffs, right? So for the scenario one, we have fuel economy emissions regulations are reset to 2020 or earlier, though through the formal rulemaking procedure. Scenario two, California is stripped of its emissions waivers by Congress when Congress ignores the Government Accounting Office's legal opinion and uses the Congressional Review Act, resulting in fewer zero-emission vehicles. California retains its waiver, and along with 11 other states, continues to demand that manufacturers decrease emissions annually or lose the ability to sell vehicles in their states, resulting in more zero-emissions vehicles. And emissions and fuel economy regulations conflict, creating confusion for automakers. And finally, the government tries to reassess whether CO2 emissions pose a danger to public health, result inability of EPA to address climate change. And both of our speakers, Mike Hartrick and Greg Chioli, and our first two speakers are going to be focusing on environment and energy. So a lot of this stuff applies to them. In terms of infrastructure scenarios, well, the bipartisan infrastructure law continues to support rebuilding laws, bridges, and EV infrastructure, scenario one. Scenario two says the law continues to support rebuilding roads and bridges, but not EV infrastructure. And scenario three, the infrastructure law will be delayed and scrapped altogether, or maybe renamed, I think it still will have to go through Congress, but we don't know about how some of these things work. Inflation Reduction Act scenarios, the IRA will not be implemented, as was during the previous administration, by freezing the funds or repealing the legislation. Or maybe the IRA funding already allocated will be distributed to the companies that qualified, but all their funding will be frozen, resulting in fewer EV, battery, recycling, mining, and processing facilities being built. And then finally, let's look at consumer scenarios. IRA funding for EV purchases will be frozen. Another scenario is that tariffs will increase vehicle prices for all manufacturers with differences among vehicles across companies and brands. Another one says overall sales decrease. And finally, even insurance costs increase as the price of imported repair parts increases. So that's kind of my setup for the conference. These are some of the scenarios that we've been talking about. I'm sure most of you have heard versions of these throughout the last few months. Let's start out with our first speaker. Mike Hartrick is a Senior Director and Executive Advisor for Energy and Environment Policy at Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Mike has 25 years of automotive experience, having worked at Auto Innovators and its predecessor organization since 2016, and at an automaker for 16 years. His experience includes energy and emissions policy and regulatory compliance planning, emissions control system, defect investigation, and vehicle engine test laboratory operations. Mike's current focus is on climate, greenhouse gas, and fuel economy policies. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Michigan Technological University. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Bruce, for the introduction. I think that was like a really good setup here. Get this good, Scott. I think there's a really good setup here. There's a lot of pieces going on. Let me just be clear. My job is essentially to try to put the pieces together, what's going on in the government and what that might mean for the auto industry, particularly in the energy and environment space. And also from the other end, try to help my automaker members put together those pieces themselves and figure out the right path forward for the auto industry as a whole. Frankly, trying to influence where the where the government goes with this. A pleasure to be here today. Arrows here. Thanks. As Bruce noted, I'm from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. I won't take a long time selling us, but we have a wide variety of members from across the entire auto industry. We represent most of the manufacturers building the vehicles in the United States. I would say the ones that we don't represent are the big EV-only manufacturers, mainly due to policy differences. We also have supplier members, equipment suppliers, battery producers, semiconductor makers, technology companies, and autonomous vehicle developers. And just note very briefly that if you're interested in membership, we have a number of affiliate memberships and also are open to pretty much anybody in the auto industry. So if you're interested in that sort of thing and want to have a little bit better insight into what's going on in the auto industry, I encourage you to give us a call and we'll talk to you a little bit more about it. So before I begin, I also want to be clear that the opinions I express here today are going to be my own and don't necessarily reflect those of my member companies. I speak based on my experience here in the auto industry and in particular on energy and environment policy. So back to the title here. May you live in interesting times, right? This is a Chinese curse in form of a blessing. And I think that's kind of where we are today. We're certainly living in interesting times in the auto industry. You know, our century-old business is being turned on its head in multiple ways. You know, we're trying to make a transition to electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, China. All of these are sources of upheaval to our industry and what were previously comfortable norms that we were living in for probably 50, 60 years before that. Now we have a new administration and a new Congress. You know, I started this year by saying everything old is new again. I'm thinking, gee, you know, we've seen this script from the Trump administration before. We kind of know how this is going to play out. And I'd say the big difference this time, and I think Bruce's slides really kind of hit the nail on the head in this case, you know, the Trump administration is doing similar things to it that it did in its first administration, but it's doing things a lot faster and, you know, and dare I say it, a little bit more haphazardly. It's really difficult to wrap our hands around where it's going because, you know, policy seems to be one way one day, seems to be another way the next day. You know, there's a lot of things that he says he's doing. I see a lot of things coming out of the administration in terms of, you know, here's the list of 30 things EPA is going to accomplish. And then I look at the number of people that EPA has to do 30 things. And I wonder, how can that possibly all actually happen? And the same thing is happening in the DOT space. How are we supposed to cover all of the safety issues that DOT and NHTSA are supposed to be covering, while at the meantime, also covering all the fuel economy issues that they'll probably end up covering. So a lot of things happening here. Between the two of these government and all these disruptors happening, we're also facing global supply chain and manufacturing disruptions from tariffs. And this government support for the U.S. transition to EVs is being pulled as rapidly as possible, as mentioned by Bruce. So a lot of things happening here. We're most likely rewriting the GHG and fuel economy regulations. I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, but let me put it this way. I've been doing this since roughly 2011, and this is at least the third time that I'll be dealing with essentially the same model years of regulation, rewriting them. And it's just not helpful to the auto industry to keep going back and forth like this. So what's ending up happening is automakers are serving the U.S. market and are left trying to navigate these murky waters in the broader context of their long-term global competitiveness. So let me start here. A healthy and globally competitive auto industry is critical for America's economic and national security. The U.S. automotive industry is an economic contributor in every state, and in aggregate, the industry adds $1.2 trillion of value to the United States GDP, or about 5%. You know, we support about 10 million jobs in the United States, and we're the nation's largest manufacturing sector. You know, Auto Innovators itself is committed to cleaner, safer, and smarter transportation as a part of maintaining this economic powerhouse. So I'm kind of hiding my own titles here. That says tariffs. President Trump is looking at tariffs, right? So let's start by addressing that elephant in the room. Others are going to address this topic in more depth, I think, but Bruce asked me to say a few things about tariffs. So let me start very high level, and I'll try to drill down a little bit into my particular area of expertise. So I want to know, have any of you read the paper this morning? Read the news? Looked at it online? Nobody? Well, that's good, because you probably know the same amount as I do, because if you looked at the news this morning, there's probably something that has changed since yesterday, because it seems like this is changing every day. What seems to be a constant in all of this? And I would say autos seem to be a constant in all of this. You know, we've seen a lot of shifts in which country tariffs are going to be on. We've seen shifts in, you know, what pieces or what articles, if you will, tariffs will be applied to. But what I haven't seen a lot of change in is that tariffs will be applied to automobiles. So kind of building on some of Bruce's data here, I tried to pull out some of the Automotive Labeling Act content reports. They're not the easiest things to translate, so forgive me. Some of these vehicles are overrepresented, you know, as manufacturers have to disaggregate them to capture the American content of various engines and transmissions. Other vehicles are highly aggregated, especially from U.S. automakers. So U.S. automakers have a lot less variety, I would say, in terms of differences in content, so they're able to aggregate some of the data. So you have to take a little bit of this data with a grain of salt. You know, it's not that every vehicle or nearly is in the 0 to 10% U.S. content range. But I think the real takeaway here is that there's virtually no vehicle that is fully U.S. I mean, I think the ALA reports stop at about 80% U.S. content. So pretty much tariffs, especially if they're applied to parts, are going to apply to everybody in one form or another. And I think we're all aware that vehicles are imported from around the world for sale in the U.S. So a little bit of research from the Center of Automotive Research from the Center of Automotive Research. Try saying that out loud. A little bit of a study from the Center of Automotive Research on what are the impacts of tariffs, and put the title of the study down below here if you want to take a look at it in depth for yourself. But some of the high takeaways here are 25% tariff impact is about $108 billion on the U.S. auto industry, and about $42 billion alone on the Detroit 3 automakers. These costs are going to be borne by manufacturers, suppliers, and customers, and the media is already reporting that manufacturers are warning dealers of potential price increases. So a fair question to me that I think I would want to know a little bit more about is how customers are going to react to these potential tariffs. So let me direct you to a different study. Again, not an expert here on tariffs, so I'm looking at other people's work. But something recently came out from Strategic Vision. Great company, has a lot of research on consumers. They take a look at this from the psychological viewpoint of where consumers are going. And what they're finding is that over a quarter of consumers are planning on purchasing a vehicle in the next 6 months are accelerating their timeline. So in other words, let's beat the tariffs, right? Another quarter are slowing down their purchase, essentially fundamental economic uncertainty. I don't know what's going on. I'm not comfortable buying a new car right now. They're already expensive enough, and I don't know where this is heading. If you were already planning on buying a car 1 to 2 years from now, you probably fall into the two categories of you're either slowing down that purchase further or just staying the course, doing what you were already going to do. So why is this happening? According to Strategic Vision, this is a fundamental economic uncertainty, which is undermining the psychology of actually buying a high cost ticket item. These anticipated price increases, concerns in investment impacts, and a general defensive financial posture as people look at their 401ks and things of that nature. So bottom line, what Strategic Vision suggests is that many are explicitly waiting for political changes or clarity before committing to major purchases. And I think we'll see that play out in the auto industry. And I think to some extent, we'll start seeing that play out in sales data in the next couple of months. So let me jump into my area of expertise. What are the potential impacts of tariffs on energy and environment policy? My next slide had to be thrown away. I didn't get permission to use the graphics, so you'll have to bear with me and just look at a blue screen for a moment. That might be more interesting anyways, right? So what my concern is here in terms of tariffs is I'm coming from an energy and environment perspective and from my history of regulatory compliance. And I'm thinking about tariffs and how do tariffs affect battery electric vehicles. So there's research from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and what Bloomberg finds is that there are a lot of imported EVs. Certainly, we are building some EVs in the United States, particularly the Detroit 3. But after you get from Tesla, which is pretty much all built in the United States for the United States, you start seeing companies pretty much go down in a diagonal line, if you will. So about half the companies or about half the EVs are probably built outside of the United States. And what I worry about is if the EVs are the most expensive vehicles and there's also chances of tariffs on critical minerals, what does that mean for manufacturers' compliance plans if they were importing EVs? And now what Bloomberg is suggesting is that if you have EVs that are being imported and that roughly at the cost of an EV today, those imported EVs can address maybe 75% of the market. About 75% of the people buying new cars could potentially afford electric vehicles that are imported today. Now, if you were to apply 25% tariffs to those EVs, that drops the total addressable market down to about 25%. So you tell me what's that going to do to automakers' compliance in the next couple of years. And I'm going to dive deeper into that theme as we go on today. So other potential piece of tariffs that I see on the horizon here is the administration has announced a new Section 232 tariff investigation, or trade investigation, they call it. So what is a Section 232 investigation? That's all about national security. So are articles being imported in such a manner or in such quantity that it risks national security? And I think we see this theme in the Trump administration again and again, where national security is used for the excuse or the reason for taking the actions that this administration thinks is best. We can argue about whether there really are national security implications or not, but bottom line, a lot of the critical minerals going into EVs are coming from outside of the United States. And even the things that we are producing in the United States and actually mining today, or the things that we might mine tomorrow, we also don't have the processing capability. Around the world, most of the critical minerals go from wherever they're taken out of the ground. They go to China, they get processed in China, and then they go elsewhere. Or they get processed in China and be built into anodes and cathodes, and then they go elsewhere. Or they go into batteries, and then the batteries go elsewhere. But bottom line, most of it's flowing through China. So I think that it's highly likely that this investigation is going to find that the critical mineral imports, critical processed chemicals that come from those critical minerals, all of those things are going to have tariffs put on them based on a national security implication. So if we want to talk about what specifically Benchmark Minerals Intelligence is saying lately, U.S. EV supply chains are reliant on these imports. They anticipate that U.S. will continue to rely on imports of nickel, cobalt, and graphite regardless of what we do to boost domestic mining, and that this affirmative finding is probable. So That's where I think tariffs are going on EVs and like. So next piece here, leveling the playing field is one of these big themes that Trump keeps talking about. So as Bruce mentioned, the Biden administration was all about EVs, and the way I like to say it is they took a whole of government approach to supporting and requiring a U.S. transition to electric vehicles. These were really challenging standards that the Biden administration set in terms of greenhouse gases and fuel economy. But at the same time, the credit I have to give to the administration is one of the few administrations I saw that every time they were regulating, they were also trying to put a lot of effort into putting all the other pieces in place that would be required to get there. And that's what we're starting to lose now is all of that support behind EVs. So one of the Trump administration's goals, again, is what he calls leveling the playing field. Essentially, what the claim is that is everything is stacked for EVs and against ICEs. And don't you know, every customer wants an ICE, not an EV. I don't think that's true. I think there's certainly a market out there for EVs. But be that as may, that's where the president is heading. And what he's going to be doing is trying to remove as much support. I think the Republicans in Congress are doing the same sort of thing. So you combine these two branches of government, you essentially have this Republican trifecta right now. And we're going to see a lot less support for EVs. So let me just jump to infrastructure for a moment. EV infrastructure, it's been growing pretty steadily, but consumers are still identifying range anxiety and charger availability as key issues affecting decisions on EV purchases. And I promise, I'm going to bring this back to what the government is doing in a second. So if the U.S. were to try to meet the Biden administration's goals of 50% EV sales by 2030, that's roughly 33 million EVs on the road. Private and public investment needs to continue in public chargers. And you see right now, we're significantly behind in terms of where we need to be. You know, it looks like we're getting a good chunk of public chargers installed, but there's still something, I forget the exact math, but it's something about 400 charging ports that need to be installed every day if we were going to get to 50% the charging infrastructure needed to support these 33 million vehicles on the road. So a lot of work remains to be done here, but one of the first actions that the Trump administration took was to freeze this funding, as Bruce mentioned. That's going to just make it all the harder to get this infrastructure installed. It's going to fall more on manufacturers that want to sell EVs to do so. It's going to fall more on the states themselves. You know, the states I'm talking to, they don't really know where to go from here. The funding was frozen. The court, told them that they had to unfreeze the funding. I don't know whether it's been unfrozen or not. Even the funding that was previously committed to states are telling me, heck, Mike, I really don't understand if I'm going to be able to send these funds out because I don't know if I'm going to get the money, even if the federal government has already obligated it for me. So a lot of uncertainty, and essentially it's just putting a halt in the chargers going in the ground. That brings me to other EV incentives here. Yeah. So the Inflation Reduction Act created three key incentives for automakers. Now, I would say that a large amount of our time at Auto Innovators this year has been spent struggling with how do we keep these EV incentives in place. So let me talk through them very briefly. What are they? So there's the 30D, IRS 30D vehicle purchase incentives. That's the incentive that you can get up to $7,500 for an EV, but it has a number of restrictions on it related to where is the vehicle built and what is going into the vehicle. Those restrictions become harder every year. Already, even when the IRA was passed, it changed what the existing 30D requirements were and immediately knocked out most of the vehicles from getting this incentive. So this has always been a little bit of a tough one for consumers. It only applied to a certain number of electric vehicles, relatively low number out of the entire fleet. There's the 45W consumer incentives that are more of a retail, or excuse me, we're supposed to be a commercial tax credit. Manufacturers figured out how to have leases apply to that. And so a lot of the companies that are focused on leasing EVs have used 45W as the way to get these incentives to consumers. That's something that the Congress has really hated, at least certain members of Congress. And so big challenge there. And then the final one, the big one for manufacturing is 45X, tax credits to build battery plants, tax credits for cell manufacturing, tax credits for battery manufacturing. All these things are kind of on the bubble under this new Congress. We have Republicans looking very hard at EVs and saying, should we support these? I think 45X probably has the best case for it because it is a manufacturing incentive. So this is about bringing jobs back to the U.S. And there's a lot of battery plants being built in what are effectively red states. When we start talking about the consumer tax credits, those are definitely more on the edge, simply because they're focused on supporting EVs from consumers. So I think those are going to be harder ones to preserve. In general, as automakers, we are trying to preserve all of these tax credits. There may have to be paths forward with amendments to them, but we're going to do our best to try to keep these around. So let's talk about EV sales. Even before the Trump administration took office and Congress was seated, EV sales began leveling off in the U.S. in 2024. After growing 2 to 3 percentage points per year since 2020, in 2024, the EV market grew less than 1 percentage point. So I think it's important to recognize that although growth slowed, it still grew. So there's still a market out there. It's not like EV sales are just totally in the ditch. They're just flattening out. After reaching peak market share of 10.9% in December, the market underwent what appears to be a pretty typical January pullback, and then we're back up to 9.7% sales again in March. But again, that seems relatively flat to me. And without these various EV incentives and other supporting conditions like more infrastructure, it's tough for me to see exponential growth happening in the near term right now. So what's going on? What do I see happening here actually happen? What I see is hybrids gaining more market share and manufacturer interest. You can see that EVs grew more quickly than hybrids in the late teens, if you will. But by the 2020s, and especially in the last several years, hybrids have essentially outpaced both in growth, and it's actually exceeded the number of battery electric vehicles being sold. So I think that's where investments are heading right now, but I think that manufacturers are still investing in EVs. So implications for GHG and fuel economy regulations. Here's where I can dig in. I really know a lot in this space. And of course, deregulatory actions like Bruce said. So a few months ago, we had the EPA, right across the street here from you. I know all the people sitting, they're less than a mile away from us today. They issued their 50th annual Automotive Trends Report. And what they report here, what we see at the top here, just if you're trying to look at the graphics, is the top is the standards, black line, and the blue line is where automakers are. So under the line is good, over the line is bad for compliance, if you will. Bottom of it is GHG credit banks. So when manufacturers exceed the standards, or better than the standards, I should say, they generate credits. When they're worse than the standards, they burn those credits or purchase them from others. So the EPA's report on this is all large manufacturers are in compliance with the light-duty GHG program requirements. Yes. So that's good news, but there's also some troubling things just underneath the surface here. So let's look at annual GHG credit and deficit generation. Left side, all manufacturers, including Tesla, including Rivian. Right side, legacy automakers, if you will, the ones that are not EV-only manufacturers. I also took out the small volume manufacturers. So we're not looking at like the impacts of Ferrari here. We're not looking at the impacts of McLaren. We're looking at essentially the automakers I represent, those that are producing probably 95 to 98% of the vehicles being sold in the U.S. today. What we see on both is, on the left side, is we've been kind of negative since 2016. There was a positive year in 2022. Anybody want to hazard a guess what was happening in 2021 and 22 that let manufacturers catch back up to the line? Come on, throw it out, guys. Not the pandemic. Try again. What was that? Safe rule. That's the Trump safe rule years, when the standards only went up at about 1 to 1.5% per year. That's where the catch-up happened. So manufacturers are essentially, if you look at the data, they're not really catching up to the standards. They're essentially paralleling the standards. The safe rule allowed them to catch up. If we look at the legacy automakers, try not to say this negatively, but let's say since 2016, on average, legacy automakers haven't made it to the curve. Big challenge here. And EVs are a major portion of compliance already. So they keep track here. So EVs are what's contributing most of the contribution to shrinking greenhouse gas emissions. The ICE emissions, and I have no idea where I'm in my notes anymore, so you just have to bear with me. But there we go. Need to get my stats here right so I didn't misquote myself here. So important implications of this compliance level. So since 2015, ICE vehicle improvements have reduced new vehicle GHG emissions at an average rate of 1.7% per year. So that's progress. But EVs have contributed another 26 grams per mile, or about 10% lower emissions by 2024. To put it bluntly, manufacturers are highly reliant on EVs for even keeping close to the GHG standards that are in place today, and how fast the stringency of the standards are increasing. So let's look at the standards. If we go back to the Obama years, the standards increased in stringency by about 3% per year. You have the safe rule that I mentioned, or that you mentioned, where the Trump standards went up at roughly 1% per year. The headline numbers were about 1.5%. What's going on here is trucks became a greater part of the fleet. Trucks have generally a little bit less stringent standards. So we end up with a bit of a shift in the market, and we get to about 1% per year. We jump to the Biden years, and in the first year of the Biden administration, the standards were reset from not 1.5%, but not back to 3% where they were under the Obama administration. They jumped up to 8% per year. And if we look at the second rulemaking from the Biden administration, what we get is reduced flexibilities and standards that are going up at about 11% per year. So you see a little bit of flattening between 26 and 27. That's not really a flattening of standards, not really an increase or reduction in stringency. That's really where a lot of the reduced flexibilities kick in an EPA. So that wasn't just a complete cliff, if you will. Made some adjustments there to the standards, just trying to smooth things out. So what this really means is what we've ended up with is a rate in the current model years and the recent past model years that's pretty much unsustainable without a growing electric vehicle market share. And if we look out into 2027 and beyond, we start to get into standards that not only the rate exceeds what can be done with ICE vehicles, but also the overall levels that can be achieved with those vehicles. So let's talk just a little bit about stringency in 2032. By 2032, only battery electric vehicles are expected to contribute positively to compliance. So I know there's a lot of news on both sides out there, right? One side of the news says these are EV mandates. The other side of the news says these aren't EV mandates. Manufacturers, this is a fleet average program. You just have to build some vehicles that are better, some vehicles that are worse. So what vehicles are better, what vehicles are worse? And I'll tell you, battery electric vehicles are the only ones that are better. By 2032, the standards, and this is EPA's model, and this is not me just making up numbers, they say that the average ICE vehicles will probably be worse than their targets by 125 to 182 grams per mile. You know, those are just massive numbers. That's not just like a tweak in a tire or something to try to make up that sort of gap. Strong hybrids, that's pretty good technology, right? You know, by 2032, probably 70 to 100 grams per mile on average from their targets. Plug-in hybrids, that's a pretty good technology too. Let's go that way. Gee, it's going to be roughly neutral. So it's not going to hurt me in terms of compliance, but it's not going to help me either. So again, battery electric vehicles, not an electric vehicle mandate per se, but certainly about the only way to comply is by building electric vehicles and having a relatively large electric vehicle market share. So what EPA projected in blue is where they thought that how manufacturers would support such standards. You know, getting to 70% approximately EV market share by 2032, roughly 55% by 2030. And oh, gee, we were supposed to be at 20% in 2024. Where were we? 10 to 11%, right? You know, I think EPA's early projections had it maybe closer to 14% if you look at the reports. So what we're doing is we're falling behind here. You know, if EPA expected double the market share in 2024, it just tells me that we're behind this curve and we're not catching up to it right now. So let's jump into what the administration is saying here. And this will get into where do I think this is all headed. We already know deregulatory actions are on the table. So executive orders and agency memos. What Trump wants to talk about is no EV mandates. What Secretary Duffy has said formally to his agency is to reconsider 2022 and later CAFE rules. And what Administrator Zeldin of the EPA said is let's reconsider 2027 and later GHG rules. A little bit of a disconnect on years. I'll get to that in a second here. So let's start looking a little bit deeper at the people running these agencies. Underneath Secretary Duffy is Deputy Secretary Steve Bradbury. Steve Bradbury comes from the Heritage Foundation, also your authors of Project 2025, which I'm sure you've heard of. So what's he said in the past, because I think this is probably pretty informative to where this goes in the future. First, fuel economy and GHG are two sides of the same coin. So I think we would agree with him as the auto industry. When we improve fuel economy, we improve GHG emissions. When we improve GHG emissions, generally speaking, unless we're talking about the air conditioning systems of the cars, we're also improving fuel economy. Let's bring that to his next point, though. EPA cannot usurp NHTSA's fuel economy standards and limitations with EV rules. This is starting to tie the two of these together more closely in the people that are acting in the government capacity's mind here. So if EPA can't usurp NHTSA's fuel economy authority, that means that the EPA standards can't be a whole lot more stringent than the NHTSA standards. So he also supports that past joint rules resulted in coordinated standards. He likes that idea that these standards all act in tandem and they need to be put together. You know what? The auto industry is already regulated with 7 different regulations on the tailpipes of vehicles. You know, if we look at just even the federal side, just fuel economy and GHG, there's 2 of them right there. California GHG is a third. We have the ZEV mandate, which requires, California requires us to build electric vehicles. We have 2 tailpipe emissions standards, criteria emissions, that is. And we also have, the last one is the fuel economy of EVs that go into the CAFE program. Gee, I didn't know EVs burn fuel, but there you have it. So anyways, we need coordinated rules. That was the whole premise of the Obama program, was one national program where manufacturers could build one fleet of vehicles that complied with all of these regulations. So past rules resulted in coordinated standards. He also has some opinions on what NHTSA must consider. They kind of follow along with what the statute says, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But what he gets at is a lot of things that are related to economic practicability, including safety. I think none of us would argue that NHTSA should be considering safety. He also gets into vehicle affordability, supply and demand economic realities. You know, what is the market going to do versus what's being required by the regulation? And the practical needs and desires of consumers. What do consumers actually want out of vehicles? I think we can all argue there's a lot of space in there for a lot of different opinions on what manufacturers should be building. But I think manufacturers themselves would say, we want to build the cars that customers want to buy. And then we'll work on regulations from there and try to make everything fit in this neat little box. There's also a little bit about the U.S. need to conserve energy and reduce strategic dependence on foreign inputs. And then finally, President Trump, somewhat at random, completely unrelated executive order, he says, we're going to go back, probably to a 2020 standard. Thank you, Bruce. You already brought that one up, right? So what's the law actually say? CAFE has to be 35 miles per gallon by 2020. It has to consider technological feasibility. You know, so this is, you know, can you build this thing that's going to be required to get to that fuel economy level, if you will? Has to consider economic practicability. Can you do this in a reasonable time frame? Are you making companies go broke trying to do this? Or are you constraining the market to the point where manufacturers can't build the vehicles that customers will buy? Things of that nature. The effect of other motor vehicle standards of the government on fuel economy. An interesting one because there's not a lot of definition behind it. This has been used to justify considering the ZEV mandate as part of a standard of the government, if you will, on and off over the years. It's also been used to tie GHG and fuel economy regulations together. It's also been done in the context of safety. There's a lot of different ways to look at what is another standard of the government and how does that affect fuel economy. Finally, the need of the United States to conserve energy. Remember, the CAFE law was written back in the 70s when we were going through the Arab oil embargo, and the entire point was to try to reduce petroleum dependence. Although this term also has been expanded in recent years depending on the administration. Some administrations want to take a very narrow reading that this is all about petroleum. Other administrations want to say that pretty much anything related to energy, including emissions, should also be considered. A couple of key limits, though, on NHTSA when they set CAFE regulations, and I think this is important for understanding where this is probably headed. You can't consider EV fuel economy. The past administration played a little bit loose with that. You know, they pulled in EVs in various places. They were sued on it. Again, I've said I did these same rules 3 times over now. Well, I think I'm about 3 rules deep now in litigation that's been put in abeyance. It's put in abeyance because the next administration comes, new litigation, put in abeyance, new litigation, put in abeyance. So we're about 3 layers deep where we haven't actually gotten a court decision on this yet. And then finally, you can't consider trading, transferring, or availability of credits. The important thing to think about here is Tesla. You know, where are the manufacturers? We flip back up a couple of slides, right? I showed you the legacy automakers generally trailing standards. How are they compliant still? It's because they're purchasing credits. It's because they banked credits from early years of the program. So focusing on purchasing credits, the law says NHTSA can't do that. They can't say Tesla can save their bacon if we set the standards here, it's all okay. EPA emissions, a lot broader, if you will. Regulate emissions from motor vehicles that endanger public health or welfare. That's where we get into the endangerment finding. Does EPA have the authority? Well, if they endanger public health and welfare, they do. Provide time for development and application for the requisite technology. Can you build it or can you develop it? That's technological feasibility if we were to look at the CAFE equivalent. And the application of the requisite technology. Can I get it on vehicles and can I get it sold, right? So that's more along the lines of economic practicability, said in a little bit different words. So here, entirely my opinion. This is not what my members are telling me to say, so you'll get Mike's opinion now. NHTSA, large and in charge. You know, you look back at these statements about joint rulemaking, you look at the statements from Project 2025 and Steve Bradbury that NHTSA, or the EPA, excuse me, cannot usurp NHTSA's authority. And I think what that leads to is NHTSA is going to be the one driving the boat this time around, and they're going to be the ones getting to set the standards. And I think it also means that they're going to be the ones essentially in the lead. You know, if there's a joint rulemaking, they'll probably be doing the modeling. If there's a delay in terms of who goes first, I think it's EPA following NHTSA, not NHTSA following EPA. What years are this going to affect? You know, we've talked about everything from 2020. We've got rules that go out to 2032. We can go even further. So let me talk a little bit about that for a moment. So I would say model years 2027 through 2030 are almost certainly going to be changed. Let's look at 2031 and 2032. I would give that a probable, those are probably going to change. You know, those standards were set by the Biden administration. If nothing else, Trump is all about getting rid of anything his predecessor did. Regardless of what it is, just get rid of it, right? So I think 2031 and 2032 are pretty sure something's going to happen in that space. The only reason I have any doubt about that is this, right? We did that with maximum feasible standards by 2021 through 2030. Why did I say it that way? The law is written a little bit oddly when we come to CAFE. It's been changed so many times, amended so many times. Right now, when ESA in 2007, the Energy and Information Security Act of 2007 was passed, they gave NHTSA very specific directions for 2020, hit 35 miles per gallon. They gave specific directions for before 2020, set standards that ratably improve in every year. And after 2020, they said, for 2020 through 2030, we want you to set the maximum feasible standards. What happens after 2030? I think it's an open question. The statute isn't clear whether there's a continuation of authority of 2030 was the last year. You know, so again, going back to 2031 through 2032, this administration may say 2030 is the last year we have any authority for, but on the other hand, you have, these are Biden standards, let's go fix them, if you will. let me go a little bit further, 2033 through 2035. Let's say we get past the 2030 NHTSA statutory authority question. Is it possible to get to 2033 through 2035? I would answer yes. NHTSA is prevented from setting standards for more than 5 model years at a time, but it isn't prevented from setting standards today and then setting standards again tomorrow to set further in the future. And generally speaking, I think that the interpretation here is going to be that as long as they only set 5 years at a time and not setting new standards, they can set more. So 3 years of more standards, that's a possibility. That allows the administration to lock in their standards or version of standards for a little bit longer, at least until another administration changes them again. So I give that a maybe. I'm not convinced that's going to happen. It's a possibility, though, in my mind. Let's go backwards, though. Model years 2025 and 2026. These are the model years we're currently building as an auto industry. So model year 2025 starts roughly mid-year 2024 for most manufacturers and goes roughly through mid-2025 calendar year for others. So building those vehicles, as early as January 2nd of this year, we could start building model year 2026 vehicles, and some manufacturers already have. Given that these are still open rules, where we're actually still building vehicles, and even if a rule doesn't get finalized until early 2026, we still won't have submitted final reports for model year 2025. So I think these are likely on the table, especially given where manufacturers stand in terms of compliance and the things that Steve Bradbury is saying and what the various executive orders say. If you want to go a little bit further back and talk about these 2022, 23, 24, 23, 24, my opinion is possibly. Certainly some evidence that the standards were beyond the maximum feasible. Manufacturers generally trailing behind in the CAFE space and in the EPA space. So I think there's some reasoning there. I think it's a little bit harder to say for sure because I don't know if there's really a precedent for doing this and how to go about doing this. That's a question that I think all of us are struggling with. Is this even possible? And I don't think there's a clear answer, and I don't think there will be a clear answer until a court weighs in. You want to go back to 2020, what does Trump say, this 2020 and beyond? I don't see 21 and 2022 as being much of a question, and I say that because these are the Trump standards. They're generally allowed manufacturers to catch up like we talked about earlier. I just don't feel 21 and 2022 are really on the place to get changed here. So again, my opinion, just some thoughts here. I think what NHTSA does, though, is I think they focus on economic practicability considerations. You saw the list earlier, and I think they focus on energy and minerals. And this one's an interesting one because what Bradbury's written about energy is, look, when the CAFE law was written, we were going through Arab oil embargoes, looking at monopolies globally on this oil. Now what Bradbury's looking at is he's looking at this and saying, gee, fracking came about. We've got a lot of oil in the United States. We're not exporter, excuse me, I shouldn't say it because I don't remember that for sure. We are exporting oil. Do we really need to conserve it is his question. So I think that's maybe a reason that he uses to justify less stringent standards. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying that that's a reason he will say. And then he looks at critical minerals and says, here's where it's a little bit two-sided, right? We're only supposed to be looking at energy, but let's look at critical minerals too. This administration has treated critical minerals as energy. A lot of the executive orders related to energy include critical minerals as part of them. So the argument here is that, hey, we're becoming more reliant on foreign inputs of critical minerals because of electrification. Let's take care of that from a regulatory perspective. So I think these are the reasons he uses to justify different standards. He also is going to say, let's base this all on ICE. The law says I have to base it on ICE, so I'm going to focus only on ICE vehicles. What does that really mean? That means let's pull ICEs completely out of the analysis, and let's assume that let's pull EVs out of the analysis, and let's assume that no EVs are going to be built. That's a legal thing. Again, the courts haven't completely weighed in where the line may be. But I think that this is where CAFE is going under this administration, is we're going to be looking at something where only ICEs are part of the analysis and only ICE technologies are setting the standards. Finally, here's the real wild card in my mind and what keeps me up at night. EV emissions and fuel economy. So this administration doesn't like EVs. They say they're unfairly advantaged in regulations. They say they're unfairly advantaged in legislation. They're unfairly advantaged in the incentives given to them. So what does EPA do with this? Well, our position has been for years that EVs have no tailpipes. They don't have emissions. They can be part of the standards because they are automobiles, but automakers can't be responsible for upstream emissions from other industries. You know, power industry, take care of that. In EPA, if that's a concern, regulate the power industry. But we can't, as automakers, I don't control what comes out of a power plant. I don't control whether they're burning coal, natural gas, you name it. They should have zero emissions at the tailpipe. I think there's a lot of oil and gas interests out there today, liquid fuel interests, if you will, that don't like that. They want to see upstream emissions applied to electric vehicles. EPA has had some math on the books for years that's never really taken effect that does so. So my concern is the EPA starts adding upstream emissions onto EVs, and you know this over-compliance of an EV and this leverage, if you will, goes away or is reduced. And that's a big problem from a compliance perspective, essentially requiring the rules to be rewritten if you want manufacturers to even be close to complying with them. On the other side, you have the DOE's fuel economy, petroleum equivalency factor for the fuel economy of electric vehicles. Again, a surprise to me that EVs burn petroleum, but there you have it. DOE has to set an equivalency factor based on the relative efficiencies. Am I running out of time here? I can tie up in just a moment then. So, lost my train of thought here. So anyway, if DOE changes the fuel economy of EVs, that's also problematic with the current regulations. So let me just flip to the end here, give you kind of my closing thoughts. Does that work for you? Okay, see, I didn't think I was going to go that long, but here I am. So I did want to share a couple of closing thoughts with you before I left today. So let me just flip through here. Where does this all leave the industry? So tariffs are an ongoing and growing compliance challenge to automakers. They could be a compliance problem. We're already capital intensive and capital constrained industry, now facing further cost challenges and supply chain challenges. By the time we see any formal regulatory proposals, we're already building model year 26 vehicles, and we'll be at the start of this, we'll be near the end of this 23 through 26 period, where there's a rapid regulatory stringency increase that generally drove vehicle electrification due to the pace of requirements. We're going to be jumping off into the 2027 and later regulatory requirements so that we're on what we called the ragged edge of achievable when we thought that EVs might be able to get to 50% market share by 2030. We know there's a mismatch between current EV market dynamics and mandated EV sales, especially in the Northeast states, you know, that are following the California ZEV regulations. These challenges have to be addressed by setting reasonably achievable requirements that continue long-term progress in a legally durable manner. This is the better solution to regulatory stability and the long-term planning it enables, as opposed to the political parties each spiking the ball when they receive it. So I'll tie up there and say thank you. I'm happy to take questions, though, and expand on any of these things. So,
Very good.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Mike. I'm going to stop the share here. And Guido, are you still with us? Guido Vildoso is online. We've got Greg Keolian, and is Mike Jackson here yet? And Mike's here. Mike, if you want to join in on this Q&A, if you have things you want to add to this, you can do that. Let's see. Okay. Great presentation, Mike. Really gets some great ideas for us for a discussion as well.
Yeah, I tried to set that up that way, Bruce. So, you know, I think there's a lot. How about you? I think there's a lot of places we should be discussing here, and I tried not to give every answer for exactly that reason, because I think that me just saying these things aren't as good as us discussing them, especially when we get to things like where should the standards be going. Yeah.
One of the ones that jumped out at me was the story about the traditional automakers not meeting their goals, right? And then having to meet their goals by buying credits. And we know that historically it was the credits that allowed Tesla to develop and to survive.
Yes.
And also now we've got Rivian as well that's probably selling credits as well. Does it become, if this continues in this direction, does it continue to incentivize EV makers to be profitable because they can continue to sell their credits?
Yeah, Bruce, kind of off the top of my head here, of course. I think EV makers continue to be around, right? I mean, this is not, whatever this administration does, the EV-only automakers, especially like a Tesla that's already well established, they're going to keep building vehicles. Nothing says you can't build an electric vehicle. And I would say the legacy automakers are going to also keep building EVs. What we're really seeing, I think, is going to be a rebalancing. And, I hate to say it, but I mean, these are pendulum swings right now, and they're probably even more severe than a pendulum, which eventually stops, right? This just seems to be getting more extreme every time the pendulum swings back and forth rather than slowing down. So I think this administration does their best to discourage EVs, but at the same time, I think there's a market out there, and I think manufacturers continue to do it. Do the EV-only manufacturers become less profitable because of it in terms of credit sales, I think was maybe the root of your question. That's not the primary part of their business anymore. I think that if you look at their reports that they're making a lot of money on selling credits, but they're also making money selling cars. They're making money selling things that go on the wall to power your home. So I think they remain profitable and they remain around. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump on that.
Yeah. Mike, do you have anything you want to add? No? Greg, do you have anything you want to add on that one? Okay. Now, one of the things that was interesting in your talk had to do with looking at how things may change in the future. I kind of look back to the past, and I wonder if we'll see something like very small incremental increases in fuel economy regulations, like we saw almost all of the 80s and the 90s, where you're talking about 0.1% increase in fuel economy. Do you think that's one of the things that you might see from the new administration?
Yeah, and I'm going to say, unfortunately, again, speaking somewhat for myself, but also speaking for the industry here, if the administration sets flat standards, that's not really helpful for us. It doesn't really suit long-term planning because it's probably not durable, right? What's inevitably going to happen when these standards are set is within weeks, literally weeks, the administration is going to be sued and people will be challenging these regulations. So what a durable regulation needs to have is it needs to follow the law. It needs to, for example, be the maximum feasible, right? And you can put a lot of words around all of these different things that NHTSA has to look at. But at the end of the day, somebody else has to go and say, is that a reasonable execution of your authority? And what I'd rather see is standards that increase at a reasonable rate that's achievable, but that can also be defended as the maximum feasible under the law, because those are the standards that are going to be more durable and allow manufacturers to have that long-term planning horizon. Something that's flat, something that goes up at 0.25% per year, these very small incremental changes. I think you're referring to like when Congress wasn't even allowing NHTSA to set standards, right? But yeah, it doesn't help the auto industry to set standards that just don't meet the laugh test. So let me just leave it there.
Mike, do you ever want to add?
If I could, then just. Michael, great insights. All I wanted to add was simply the fact that the last thing that anybody wants is for the U.S. or for North America to be an island, right? We know it's a global industry, right? And so there are global standards. There are going to be differences, of course. But I think the biggest question or the biggest issue is that there are massive investments that have already been made, and so I think the bigger challenge is how do we continue to foster innovation? And so, I think, one could argue that, electrification was maybe, there was a construct that favored electrification over a broader range of other technologies. And so I think the idea of having a range of technologies or a portfolio of technologies offers diversification, offers an opportunity for suppliers and manufacturers to benefit from a range of opportunities. And so I think the idea of pursuing one and choosing a winner represents a hurdle and a headwind. And so I think, ultimately, we don't want the U.S. to be an island so that it no longer, because we know that the automakers are active and engaged, not only in the U.S., but obviously globally. And so the same, holds true for suppliers as well.
Absolutely agree.
Thanks, Mike. Now, when do manufacturers have to pay the vehicle fees for missing targets? What's the cost difference between buying credits versus fines? Do we have enough EV credits coming into the market?
Whole present to unwrap there. I can imagine certain people who might ask me that question. Yeah. So EV. So we don't know what a credit costs. Let me start there. That's something that's always been between Tesla and whoever they're selling credits to. Don't have any particular knowledge I can share in that area without violating confidentiality from my past experiences. What are the fines? Getting more expensive, let me put it that way. NHTSA's up to $17 per tenth of a mile per gallon, multiplied by the size of the fleet. So some manufacturers have, I did the math several weeks ago, so forgive me for not being able to quote an exact number, but we're nearing $1 billion in penalties over the past several years, mostly due to the minimum domestic passenger car standard, which is the flat standard as opposed to the attribute-based standard. The big difference is going to be GHG versus CAFE, and why you see so much focus on manufacturers in the GHG space is the Clean Air Act penalties are over $50,000 per violation. So EPA has some math for calculating how many vehicles didn't meet the standard. But when I did the math a few weeks ago again, I calculated that it's probably the fines associated with not meeting GHG standards are in the probably 10 times as high as the CAFE standards, not to mention that they would be overlapping, essentially the same sorts of violations, for the same sort of behaviors. What was the last part of your question, Bruce?
Had to do with...
Are there going to be enough EV credits?
Yeah.
Yeah. Depends on the regulation we're talking about. Does that mandate? Probably not, especially as we get towards 100%, unless the market's taking off. The GHG and CAFE standards. CAFE, I'm not sure about because CAFE has always been a little bit more loose in terms of paying penalties, if you will. If we're talking about the GHG standards, all I can say is that the credit banks have been going down every year as credits have either expired or manufacturers have fallen behind. And as we go further into these regulations, you have to remember as regulations increase in stringency, the credits produced for exceeding them also get reduced, right? Because there's less gap between the two. I can't really say how many.
Mike, did you have anyone to add on that? Okay. Interesting point you're making about about critical minerals.
Yeah.
The IRA was supposed to also consider critical minerals. It was going to bring processing and mining. They were spending money for this, right? And it seems to be that the current administration is kind of thinking in the same way, but not for EV type of story, but for other critical minerals that were part of probably chips and things like that. Is that what you see that happening as well?
This is where the administration is really confusing, right? So their executive orders, and maybe you have a good answer to this too. Their executive orders early on here, like I said, they include all the critical minerals that go into batteries. It makes sense for the United States to build EVs, right? To the extent we're going to build EVs, why would we not want them built in the United States? So I'm really kind of confused, in how this administration is putting this all together, because if we're going to be building EVs, why wouldn't we want them built here? And why would we, as the United States, when was the last time? I mean, I'm back to the Bretton Woods generation, right? So I mean, I've lived my entire life under that context, but when has the United States backed off from trying to be a technological leader? And that's really confusing me here, why we would let, China be the EV technology leader. We don't want to invest in these things anymore, and we don't want to build them here. So I think ultimately, hopefully this administration wraps its head around that, EVs aren't all bad, and maybe some of the Elon Musk stuff, forgive me for bringing it up, plays into this space, but EVs aren't all bad. We need to have a way to build these vehicles and to find that next jump in the technology where we can be the leaders in it. Maybe sodium-ion batteries. I'm just throwing that out here.
Yeah. Very good. All right. We're going to stop it now. You guys stick around. We'll do Q&A after Greg. And so please stick around if you want to kibitz with us on this as well. Okay? Sure. Thank you. Next speaker, Greg Keolian. Greg is the Peter M. Weg Professor of Sustainability Systems at the University of Michigan and serves as co-director of the Center for Sustainable Systems, which he co-founded in 1991. So it tells you how long Greg's been doing this. The center focuses on systems analysis to accelerate climate and sustainability solutions across energy, mobility, built environment, water, and food systems. He was also appointed more recently to co-direct the Michigan Hydrogen Initiative and serves as the LCA, a lead for the U of M Electric Vehicle Center, which just started recently. He earned his PhD in chemical engineering from the U of M in '87. For more than 3 decades, he's engaged and collaborated with the auto industry for advanced sustainability. Greg was named to the Reuters hot list of the world's top climate scientists for 2021. Welcome, Greg.
Good morning, everyone. Today's Earth Day, April 22nd. I'm going to take a little different perspective on this topic, really looking at it in terms of characterizing environmental and economic sustainability in terms of the administration's impact. And I guess maybe to help you get into that perspective, I'm going to ask, how many of you have children? How many of you have grandchildren? One. Anybody great-grandchildren? No? Well, I want you to approach this topic thinking about your children and your grandchildren. We're focusing on EVs. They're a solution to the greenhouse gas problem, the climate change. That's why a big reason why we have electric vehicles. I've worked with the auto industry, engaged and collaborated over the last 3 decades. We actually published a book out of an automotive seminar that we held with Ford, GM, Chrysler back in the mid-90s, published by the Society of Automotive Engineers, concluding that the current, at the time, internal combustion engine vehicle was not sustainable. And actually, there was a lot of critique of that by the industry, but those in the industry that later retired said they agreed with me. So I'm going to share some perspectives based on research over the years. Our center has published over 1,000 publications recently, and a good majority of our research is focused on the auto industry. So my agenda is going to start with some foundational knowledge about climate change science, really looking at the physical science. Then we'll talk about the impacts in terms of damage and cost. I'll get into the policy and in terms of CAFE, GHG, just to see how well are we doing with regard to those policies to meet goals and trajectories to reduce carbon. Like covered that very well, so I really appreciate that. And I'm going to characterize the industry in terms of emissions, in terms of energy consumption and supply chains. From a life cycle lens, we're going to look at the clean energy transition, looking at emissions of EVs compared to ICE vehicles. We'll look at the total cost of ownership, talk about charging infrastructure. But I want to start with foundational knowledge. And that foundational knowledge comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was established to bring together the best information from a review of literature, science in terms of the physical science, in terms of impacts, in terms of how to mitigate. They publish every 4 years or so reports, different working groups. It's very clear that climate change is widespread, it's rapid, and it's intensifying. This is the basis, for our action. And I think many don't even understand the basic phenomena of the greenhouse effect. So I'm going to start there with a little physics. I'm a chemical engineer, another chemical engineer just before us. So what we have here is the sun emits ultraviolet radiation. Okay, it is shortwave radiation. Some of it's reflected off the clouds, 30% of it. The other energy hits the surface of the Earth, which is critical. And then we radiate energy as long wave. It's actually infrared radiation, and it's based on the temperature of our planet. The sun's hotter than us. They radiate shortwave. We radiate infrared out into space. However, we have greenhouse gases, and we do need greenhouse gases. Otherwise, we'd be inhabitable in terms of temperature. But our gases are increasing, and they're trapping heat. They're blocking this radiation, infrared, to get out into space, which is leading to an increase in temperature of the planet. Okay, and I could spend a whole hour, I have a whole lecture on this effect and based on physics, but that's the short view of it. What we're observing is the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is going up. This is measured, right? We're seeing this trend, it's going up because we're emitting more greenhouse gases. This is starting in 1960, but you can go back the Industrial Revolution. And correspondingly, we're seeing an increase in the temperature of our planet. You could see it going up to above 1.5. 2024 was the hottest year on record. You can see we're hitting this 1.5C. That is the threshold at which we don't want to exceed to avoid the most adverse effects of climate change. So we're right there. There's models that project what the future temperature is going to be. These are very complex models. There are natural factors that affect the balance between the incoming and the outgoing radiation. There are human-induced factors, our burning of fossil fuels. If you look at comparing the models with observation, if you just take into account the natural factors, you could see there's not good agreement over here. If you take into account the human-induced factors and observations with regard to temperature, we have better agreement. You put the two models together and we have attribution and very good agreement. It's unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, oceans, and land. Precipitation is changing, temperature is changing, sea level is rising. that has consequences. This is data from NOAA indicating the record of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. In 2024, there was 27 individual disasters worth at least $1 billion in damage. Total cost over the year was $182 billion. Now, these dollars are not factored into cost-benefit analyses. Right? These are costs that we all bear. They're externalities. This affects our insurance rates, right? And it's difficult to get insurance in certain areas where there's fire, hurricanes, flooding. These are the events. And if you look over the period between 1980 and 2024, I could admit this person. If you look over that period, we're talking about almost $3 trillion. The frequency of these events is increasing and intensifying. That is problematic. This is affecting the life support system of our planet. These effects are irreversible, so we need to take action. The more we delay, the greater the cost. There are still many that don't believe in climate change. They're climate change deniers. Our president has referred to climate change as a hoax. A colleague of mine in our school studied the influencers of climate deniers and the believers. And you could see in red are the influencers of the deniers. And then I kind of blew up to the right there, the primary influencers of deniers. There's two large circles that kind of stand out. One of them is our president, an influencer of climate denial. We have the best scientists in the world working on these reports every year. It's unequivocal. This is happening, and yet we have a leader that is an influencer of climate deniers. What do we need to do with regard to climate change to avoid even more adverse effects for your children, grandchildren? This is the pathway to limit warming to 1.5 C, which is the threshold of avoiding the most adverse effects. We have to cut CO2 emissions roughly in half by 2030. This is relative to 2010. We need to hit net zero by 2050. Okay, that's the trajectory. And we have trajectories about greenhouse gas standards, but this is ultimately what we need to achieve to maintain the life support system of the planet. So this was brought up. There's the endangerment finding, which is the basis for action of curbing greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, the finding was that these greenhouse gases that trap heat endanger public health and welfare. There's overwhelming evidence for this. It's been upheld by the courts, requires EPA to take action, curb emissions from vehicles, power plants, other industries. And it follows a Supreme Court landmark decision that basically, obligates the EPA to curb pollutants. This is being challenged. this was covered extremely well and in much more depth, but we have these standards to reduce emissions following a certain schedule. These are emissions, tailpipe emissions, and I'm going to talk about life cycle emissions because there are emissions in making an EV that are very important. This is also, I don't have to spend any time on this either. NHTSA, sets the requirement in terms of a fleet average fuel economy, 50.4 miles per gallon by 2031 for passenger cars, light trucks. Benefits in terms of saving fuel costs, $23 billion, preventing a certain amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. But what we're seeing, and this was, I think, highlighted very well in the previous talk, our improvement is being threatened in terms of CAFE. Growth in EVs and charging infrastructure also threatened, which is a key solution to addressing climate change for the auto industry. And a lot of it is unfounded basis of an energy emergency, right? We hear the themes of drill, baby, drill, frack, frack, frack. But is there an energy shortage? I argue that the real energy emergency is to address climate change. We need to accelerate the clean energy transition. That is the emergency. So what is the contribution of our industry? So transportation sector is responsible for 28% of the emissions of greenhouse gases. You break that down, light duty vehicles are 57% contribution. So the key strategy is EV adoption to decarbonize this sector. My research over the last 30 years is doing life cycle modeling of products and technology to measure sustainability performance, create carbon footprints, energy footprints, and look at where are the opportunities to improve. So this is a generic life cycle that starts with raw materials, goes through manufacturing, use, you have service, and then you retire the vehicle, you look to recycle, remanufacture. We draw boundaries around the system and we characterize the inputs and materials and energy and the outflows in terms of emissions, and we look at products. So this allows us to establish a scientifically based measure of sustainability performance. So 30 years ago, we worked with Ford, GM, and Chrysler, the material industries, the Iron and Steel Institute, American Plastics Council, Aluminum Association, and we modeled a mid-sized vehicle. It took 3 years, 20,000 parts and components, doing all those flows, and you get this profile of the energy use. And you could see a majority of the energy is in the use phase, right? You see the material production, which is the steel, the aluminum, the manufacturing. And we could look at this framework to evaluate lightweighting benefits. So you reduce energy in the use phase, but if you use aluminum, you could increase the energy in production. This allows you to look at that trade-off. So I've looked at lightweighting, I've looked at PHEVs, EVs, flying cars, autonomous vehicles over my career. We recently completed a study of the electric Vehicle Center at the University of Michigan to evaluate the greenhouse gas reductions comparing ICE with other electrified vehicles, we characterize that reduction potential looking at purchasing decisions and operational choices. So we've looked at the various classes of vehicles. We looked at use patterns in terms of utility factors of PHEVs, drive cycles, cargo, where you charge your vehicle, because that affects the grid emissions. It also, where you drive your vehicle affects the fuel economy. So we took into account temperature effects. We looked at the charging of the vehicle over its life as the grid is changing. And colleagues from Ford, Alan Taub, former vice president of research at GM, was part of an author on this study. And this is an update of a previous study a couple of years ago with Ford Motor Company, looking at electrification of pickup trucks and other vehicles. And actually from that study, we're seeing greater reductions of the EV because the grid is getting even more less carbon intensive. The upper chart here shows you the emissions associated with production of the vehicle, and we're going across from ICE to BEVs. And these are bigger BEVs with range, 400 mile. And you could see for sedans, we go up, midsize, up, pickups, up. So you're saying, well, you're increasing greenhouse gas emissions in producing the vehicle. That is true. We're increasing it because of the battery. The battery accounts for about half of the emissions. You could say, how is this contributing to a climate solution? Well, it all comes down to the use phase, which dominates. That's the lower chart here, which shows the total life cycle emissions of production, use, retirement. And you could see dramatic reductions. This is average across the United States. Major advantages in terms of reducing life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. And so we could look across, if we look here with a baseline of 100% for the pickup truck of 486 grams per mile on average over the life, we could drop down, we go across, and we could see greener because of lower emissions. And this represents, relative to the pickup, a BEV 200 range sedan at 17%, or an 83% reduction. We could then look at taking a baseline of an ICE vehicle and we move across to BEV. We see reductions about 75% compared to ICE. If we start with an HEV, where the industry, many of the gas vehicles are, we see a 68% reduction. And then the other strategy here is downsizing, right? Instead of driving a SUV, large SUV to work, you drive a sedan. We see reductions of up to 34%, just dropping down this way, across, independent of the powertrain, it drops about that level. So we look spatially at this. There are different grids, but universally there's benefits of vehicle electrification across the continental United States. And this is relative to ICE. This is the reduction. If you go to an HEV, so you're reducing at this level between 81 and 94 grams per mile, all the way down to the BEV, 137 to 357. If you're comparing an HEV with a PHEV or a BEV, we're here. If you're comparing a PHEV with a BEV, you're still reducing between 29 and 68 grams across the country. A lot of interest in PHEVs, and they do approach the BEV when you have very high utility factors. The utility factor is the amount of driving in electric mode, so you start to close in. But so if you're just commuting to work, you're not driving long distances, you could really come close to the BEV or be similar to the BEV, but typically utility factors for driving are more in the 50% range or a little bit higher. So how well is the industry doing with regard to meeting the IPCC trajectories in reduction that we need to achieve to stabilize the atmosphere with regard to climate change? So we did this study published in Nature Communications looking at if we electrify 50% of the fleet of US sales, I should say, by 2030, how well are we doing relative to the trajectory? And we're actually doing pretty close. But that's with 95% grid decarbonization by 2035, which was an administration goal, past administration goal. So, we're getting close to where we need to be. So this is, again, trying to look at, are we on track with the reductions needed? However, this is 50% by 2030, and we saw, I don't think we're going to see 50% sales by 2030, right? We're 10%. There's projections that maybe we're going to hit 25%. So we are falling short with regard to what we need to do to avoid the most adverse effects of climate change. So we're going backwards, right? This is aggressive, and we're close, but now we're falling short of this. And, reconsideration of the endangerment finding, right? Challenging the law, challenging the science. For an administration, the leader calls climate change a hoax. Action to terminate the EV mandate. So this was discussed. There is no EV mandate. There are standards. So an analogy to this are light bulbs. Okay, we went from incandescents to LEDs, right? There was an uproar about that we're banning incandescent light bulbs. You're taking away my choice to use an inefficient, more costly over its life light bulb. Same thing. There's a standard set because we want to conserve energy. We want to save household, but improve household budgets in terms of meeting energy use. Ability to choose a safe and affordable car for the family. So we're going to look at that. We need a key that was brought up previously. We need charging infrastructure, and you could see the same statistics where we've been moving up on that. We need to continue that trend, and this is also paused and threatened. So there's a vehicle and there's the power plant that provide the electricity. We've made good progress with renewable energy. So in 2011, 42% of the coal, 42% of the mix was coal. We're now down to 16%, 16.2%, 2023. But there's a lifting of the burdens to restrictions on coal plants. Coal electricity is about 2 pounds of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Natural gas is half that. Renewable electricity is close to zero. You're in the range of like 50 grams per kilowatt hour. Right? We need to continue to decarbonize the grid. This is an opposite signal. Although utilities are not building new coal power plants, utilities are scheduling to shut down coal power plants. So the logic is unclear. We'll look at the total cost of ownership. So we did this study with funding from the Responsible Battery Coalition, take into account purchase, operations, so fueling, gasoline, or charging with electricity, including paying for the infrastructure for home charging, maintenance, insurance. So this was published last year. And you look at the total cost of ownership made up of, the purchase of the vehicle. So when you look at BEVs, they cost more, but then you look at the fueling cost and you could see that reduced. You have insurance, but if you look at sedans over 25-year life, you see a slight reduction in cost, total cost of ownership. If you look at SUVs, there's a slight increase, but these are coming down as battery costs come down. We're going to approach parity there as well. Interestingly, if you look at the total cost of ownership here in Detroit, we're up here. And a big part of that is our insurance. We're similar to New York, which is also has very high cost of ownership, and that's driven by insurance. Concern about gas prices. This is unadjusted for inflation. And if you adjust for inflation, you're around $3 a gallon over a long period of time. So I don't think that's a driver that we need to exploit more, drill more energy to address the cost to consumers. We did work on material supply chains and flows. So we worked with Argonne National Lab on sourcing of aluminum and steel to the auto industry, aluminum from bauxite to alumina to making primary aluminum to sheet to the auto industry. Also looking at steel, it's very complex. We also evaluated the greenhouse gas emissions depending on where you source the aluminum. This is a bit older, but just to point out, not all aluminum is created equally with regard to emissions. So we used to have 22 smelters in the United States in 1995. Only 5 remain today. We get over 50% of our aluminum. This is all aluminum for the beyond the auto industry. Comes from Canada, and Canada is primarily has a large sourcing of their electricity from hydropower. So much lower carbon intensity than other locations like Oceania or Australia or China. So disrupting the flows is not only disrupting the supply chains and economics, can affect the environmental impacts. This was also brought up in terms of where is the supply of minerals, components, batteries. You could see a lot of red there in terms of China. If we look at just the mining and raw material production, copper, lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, the rare earths, you don't see a lot of the United States there. This is the United States out of all this. There are mining operations being set on lithium. Graphite is something that we're doing a study with Ford on. We're not currently producing graphite in the United States. We do have deposits that we've characterized, but you could see here in terms of the ore grade, like places like Mozambique have much higher grade. China has much higher grade and abundance. So there's a cost when you have lower grade in terms of emissions, in terms of the actual cost to produce. And it's important to note the deployment time in terms of setting up the mines and commercializing doesn't align with our demand and immediate needs. So those are also key factors. And we see that China is dominating in terms of EV production. You could see here in terms of actual EV production, registrations. And one reason why they're dominating, this is from an MIT review, how did China come to dominate the world in electric vehicles? It's about government support. So from the last talk, I don't know if we're seeing government support for the EV industry. And just recently, again, just to highlight what's going on with regard to an assault on science and this real threat of climate change. There's a mandate to report to Congress and the president about climate change impacts, risks. And this is to be done every 4 years. And the president has terminated through NASA contract support for technical staff and basically hollowed out the staff to be able to do this report. Now, this report is very important for farmers that need to figure out what they're doing with their cropping. It's important to urban planners and communities that are dealing with climate change threats in terms of flooding events. So this is what I presented today. I feel like I'm very somber here, and it is Earth Day, and but I think this is important to understand. Why are we focusing on standards and the transition? So I want you to draw your conclusions. I don't know if there are any deniers in the room. Maybe I flipped somebody that was a denier. I don't know if that was enough climate science there. But anyway, we could see that, where we're heading is further endangerment, increasing damages and costs by delaying action. It's clear that EVs decarbonize. It's a key strategy for the industry. It's key that we continue, the OEMs continue to invest in the EVs, which they are doing. I don't think they're going to stop production based on a president's actions. Total cost of ownership is there. Disruptions are only going to hurt in terms of supply chains. So thank you for your attention. More information at our center, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Greg, when you were talking about 1.5C, and that's one of the issues that we look at from that we're focusing on, and that we've already reached 1.5C in certain months during I think 2023 and 2024. If we continue to be in that, when do you start seeing even more dramatic things happening because of that?
Yeah, so projections are right now with even pledges that we have, we're going to hit 2.5C, which is we're just going to see more of these extreme events, more flooding, more wildfires. I mean, it's simple physics, right? You have warmer temperatures. The atmosphere could hold more moisture. You're getting heavier rains. You're going to get more energy going into hurricanes. Ice is melting. Sea level is rising. So it's coming, and it's going to get worse. But that's why we need to take action.
Very good. Thank you. Should consumer willingness to purchase zero-emission vehicles be a consideration in setting GHG regulations?
So this is about ensuring our welfare, right? And in terms of human health, in terms of the planet's life support system. So you want to offer choice, but I will say there is tremendous opportunity. I have a student, his doctoral research was looking at matching vehicles with needs. He's now a scientist at EPA. So there's huge opportunities if you just even look at your own household fleet. And in the fleet, instead of driving the SUV to work, you take the sedan to work. You could get a significant reduction in emissions, right? We need to utilize the vehicles, right? A large vehicle just to commute to work doesn't make a whole lot of sense in terms of efficiency. So clearly we need to have choice, and it's, you need to match your needs with your vehicle choice. But I think we could do better. And I think that it's important that we have this, fleet-wide type of mechanism to make sure that we actually hit targets that have real benefits and put us on track with trajectories for carbon reduction.
All right, Greg, here's a little challenge for you here. For better or for worse, we're living with the current administration and Congress. We can't change their opinions. So from a lifestyle basis, where are the greatest opportunities for reducing carbon emissions in ways that this administration might agree with? Yeah, it's a challenging one.
Yeah, it's a challenging one. I mean, there's plenty of ways to reduce carbon emissions in terms of your home through insulation, more efficient appliances. I don't know where they stand on that. I mean, I gave you the example of the light bulb. So it's really hard to say, where they stand, for example, on efficient appliances. In terms of automobiles, it's not clear what their policy is really with regard to energy and emissions. But what is clear to me is what you can do. What you could do as a consumer, what you could do to actually try to influence Congress, what you could do in voting coming up, reaching out to your congressman, particularly reaching out to Republicans, because they are the ones that really, have an opportunity dealing with these laws. These are laws that really need to be upheld, and funding to support the execution of mandates in terms of the laws. So I kind of waffled on that, but I can give you many things you could do to reduce.
Personally, yeah. Very good, thank you. Greg, well, why is insurance cost so different for ICE versus BEVs?
Yeah, so insurance is really based on, the cost is based on the MSRP. So you have a higher MSRP, you're going to get a higher insurance cost. I mean, there's other factors like batteries are expensive, right? A third of the cost of the vehicle. So there might be a little bit of higher premium just due to, some of the requirements, if you have an accident to replace. But ICE, EVs are expected to have lower maintenance and repair costs. But insurance is really, dictated a lot by MSRP.
Very good. Yeah, and replacement of those products, as you were
Right.
saying, right? When you look at the TCO,
Total cost of
yeah,
ownership.
total cost of ownership, and you were saying that that there isn't parity between gas and electric vehicles for SUVs and pickups. What's holding it back in terms of being parity?
Yeah, I think, you look at it and there's insurance costs I mean, the OEMs make more money on SUVs, right? They have a higher profit margin. But, you know, it's tough right now for, with the EVs, you know, in terms of profit margin. I mean, we're going through learning curves, right? It takes time for the cost to come down. And so, yeah, and the fuel economy is going to be worse for the SUV. So you have a higher cost in terms of fueling and, I should say, charging the vehicle.
Okay. All right, last question for you, Greg. One of the online questions was, the average person is never going to see the charts or hear these arguments. The current administration points are simple. How do we actually communicate all of the stuff that you're talking about to the public in a way that they will understand?
So I actually have a link here called Sustainability Fact Sheets, and we try to make this information more accessible. So that's one of the things, if you just go to our Center for Sustainable Systems and Fact Sheets. And we just need to communicate, share this information. I've spoken on, you know, weather reporters have brought me on in terms of talking to during the news, you know, just explaining climate change and talking through this. There's a lot of myths about EVs, right? You know, that there's more impact of an EV in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. You know, simply got to, you know, cite these kinds of studies that, no, they do reduce and they're beneficial. But I appreciate, you know, your role, whatever you're doing in terms of, you know, working in the industry, continue to want to support you and your efforts, and know that it's a very difficult time, but we're a resource. And so if we could help you in any way with our research to get that out there and to talk, I'm plan to be talking to a GM suppliers meeting, 2,000 suppliers, and I think it's going to be scheduled in August. It was postponed. Just need to continue to get the word out, but thank you.
Yep. Very good. Thank you very much, Greg. Let's take a 15-minute break and then come back for looking at more at the tariffs and the consumer side of the new administration. Okay, our next speaker is Mike Jackson. Mike is a strategist and trusted advisor with deep expertise in markets and product planning, as well as trends shaping the future of mobility. Mike serves as Executive Director of Strategy and Research at MEMA, the Vehicle Suppliers Association. Prior to joining MEMA, Mike led the North American Vehicle Production Forecasting practice at IHS Markit and held various strategy roles at Alcoa, Fujikura, and Faurecia. Mike holds a bachelor's of science in management strategy from Eastern Michigan University and MBA in international business from Wayne State University. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Bruce. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share a brief update with you here. Advance. There you go. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so the title of my presentation here, A New World Order. Obviously, we know that there's a tremendous amount of change happening. And I'm going to talk about tariffs, but maybe a little bit more tangentially. I want to provide some context. And so with that, let me just jump right in. You know, MEMA, you know, certainly here's the rub, right? At the end of the day, we have to work with whoever's in the administration. Our role is to represent the supplier community. And so it really doesn't matter who's in office. We need to, our whole purpose is to champion the business interests of the supplier community. And so that means that we want to make sure that we help to contribute and foster a dynamic, innovative, and profitable supplier community. And so that means that, you know, if there's going to be certainly a stronger penetration rate for electrification, how do we help make that happen? And if there's going to be a shift in policy, how do we help suppliers adjust? right? And so this is really the key factor here. We're fortunate to represent some 1,000 member companies. We contribute to over 930,000 employees across the supplier community. Largest sector of the U.S. manufacturing base contributes about 2.5% of GDP. And, again, there are many, dynamic time for sure right now. And so there are many headwinds, there are many opportunities. And so it's really a very dynamic time. So let's just jump right in. Our whole purpose, though, is, again, we want to make sure that we're helping to promote policies that encourage investment, that reduce barriers, and that foster innovation, so that we can continue to ensure that the U.S. is a global leader in advanced technology and commerce. So with that, I want to provide a little bit of global context, and then we'll also then we'll come back and touch a little bit just on the econ side, a couple of key factors, and then we'll look at the MEMA OE Supplier Barometer. Supplier Barometer is an executive survey that we conduct with our members, and then we'll wrap things up with a couple of takeaways. But what's happening in the industry? Well, this is not a big surprise to many of you, but the reality is there are some fundamental megatrends, and that is clearly we've been dealing with uncertainty here over the past 5 years. Hard to comprehend, but back in March was the 5-year mark in terms of when the U.S. Was on lockdown with the pandemic. And so since that time, obviously, a whole host of factors. We saw semiconductor shortages and release volatility, but election outcomes and certainly policy shifts. We look here, though, as well right now, and clearly that's a significant factor as well. Advanced technology on a number of different fronts. We've heard from our speakers already. Electrification is here. And again, we're part of a global industry. And so as a global industry, this technology is incredibly important, but we also see then a bit of a pivot, right, to more of a diversified portfolio. But there's also other changes that are happening all at the same time, hardware to software. And so software-defined vehicles is absolutely critical. AI and how AI is being leveraged, connectivity, contributes to some new business models, a wide range of new business models as well. Looking at supply chain resilience, this is crucial right now because we need visibility. We need to make sure that we better understand what is feasible, and so it makes it incredibly difficult in this time of uncertainty. But what's absolutely crucial here is the importance of while the administration is very eager to endeavor to reshore, this is a factor that is part of overall competitiveness. And so cost competitiveness is crucial. Sub-tier supplier distress, we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. But if we look at then, customer relations, obviously, supply chain is a function of working with the OE customers and so looking at cost recovery, looking at collaboration, how is innovation funded? And so what does that look like? And with accelerated life cycles, how do we how does a piece price work? How does that function within the environment? Because if we're looking at a much shorter life cycle, it takes time to amortize those costs, and so that's a new dynamic. If we look at geopolitical risk, there's no question that this has been something that's been playing out for a number of years. But tariffs, front and center, no question. Supply chain dependencies. Remaining tensions here between obviously Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Middle East, Taiwan, another factor, China's growing ambitions, and I would say too, even on an uneven playing field in some respects, in some instances. If we keep going, obviously capital markets, CapEx, we saw a fundamental surge here over the past few years, largely funded by, with the Inflation Reduction Act. But if we look now, cost of capital is much higher than it was, than it was expected to be, and so that's another reality. Talent and workforce development is another real factor here. There's a war on talent, and that is that having the right people and the right skills is crucial. And software is certainly an incredibly important role, and there's a tremendous amount of of competition for this talent across a wide range of different sectors. And so if we look over here as well, ESG and sustainability. Sustainability is not going away. That's certainly a reflection of the scorecard on the OEM side. Decarbonization continues to be a focus, as well as circularity. And then here, looking at regulatory dynamics, this is front and center with the shifting policy, this pendulum. But across the board, everything that Michael highlighted here earlier, regulations from the EPA, UFLPA, USMCA, absolutely critical here. And so this is an important one, as this is already in the works as far as being renegotiated here. The timeline for next year, and yet ultimately we expect that to be pulled ahead. And then, the Right to Repair Act, certainly for the aftermarket and for our members on the aftermarket side. And then, ultimately looking at the last point here, fostering competitiveness. This is really what it's about, right? It is a global industry. We know it's a capital-intensive industry. It's long lead. And so, the shifting tariffs in a very short window of time make it incredibly difficult, incredibly challenging, and are a financial burden for our members and for the industry as a whole. And so this represents a significant headwind. So with that, looking at the global economic policy uncertainty index, we're at record highs. This is not a big surprise, and yet this is where the administration is, I think, wants to be from a negotiating position, right? And so we'll keep going, but that's an important point to highlight. So I want to just touch on here, though, looking at 2024 compared to 2023 with regard to production, global light vehicle production by country. And it may be a little bit of a surprise, but there are just really a handful of countries that actually posted gains in 2024. And that would be China with a net gain of 1.3 million units. Russia, 299,000, India as well, Brazil and Mexico, followed by Poland. And that's in a flat environment, a flat market. And so, 90 million units of volume, very strong volume on a global basis. And yet we see some fundamental shifts, some very dramatic shifts across the remaining countries that are listed here. And so there are a lot of different reasons for it, and we'll touch on that in just a little bit. The key point that I want to highlight, though, is that we talked a little bit about China, and China has done very well on the EV front, but it's done well in more ways, right? China continues to grow, and if we look at 2019, the high water mark, if you will, pre-pandemic. What's pretty remarkable is that China represents a 6 million unit increase from 2019 to 2024. And if we look at that in comparison, contrasting that with Europe down 4.5 million units. And part of this comes back to Russia, Ukraine. There was a substantial amount of investment that was made in Russia, and most of these Western manufacturers walked away, right? And so as a result, and so now China is in large part shoring up that volume. And so that's one factor among many as to contributing to China's growth. But it also represents, again, another significant headwind for suppliers that are, scale is the driver of profitability. And so that is a huge factor here. And it's one of the reasons why there have been a significant number of headwinds on the electric vehicle front here as well. If we're coming closer to home, if we look at North America, 900,000 unit decline from 2019 to 2024. And so 15.5 million units last year was a pretty strong showing. And yet, so certainly much improved from the depressed volumes of 13 million units in 2020 and 2021. But, depressed still. And so this is, especially given the number of launches and vehicle launches that were on tap over these past 24 months. So quickly, if we look at capacity utilization is coming under tremendous pressure, and for a variety of reasons. But we talked about electrification, and so there's been a tremendous amount of incremental investment in new capacity, and So what is extraordinary is the fact that there's global excess capacity in the tens of millions of units. And this is in large part, contributed, it's been exacerbated by the push to electrification. The key point here, though, is that at the end of the day, if you're looking at utilization rates across this, it represents a really, really difficult environment for both manufacturers and suppliers. And so here, with the vast majority of the world's regions here in the 60% utilization rate, that doesn't bode well for an industry. And so this is another significant headwind. Moreover, China took top spot here last year, exporting 6 million vehicles outside of the country, and so this is a pretty dramatic. Russia, a very dominant force there, but Mexico also a significant contributor in terms of the market where those volumes, where those vehicles are making way. Europe as well, in Western Europe as well, and so also a significant factor there as well. So just touching on economics, we certainly were in a pretty strong place looking at the end of last year, and so post-election, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty last year. When we look at the election, and the election, many businesses, whether automotive or non-automotive, postponed their decisions. They weren't sure how to respond, and so as a result, investments were delayed, investments were postponed. And so there was actually a pretty significant surge in optimism. Small Business Optimism Index, at the end of last year surged. Stock market did well. And yet what's happened since then? Since then, we've actually seen a pretty significant fall off. And so if we look at the consumer typically contributes 2/3 to 70% of GDP. And so what we've seen is a pretty significant fall off in terms of consumer sentiment. There's a real risk. They're like, consumers are a bit frustrated, a bit unsure. What do I do? And so as a result, in some cases, they're postponing, they're delaying those purchases. On the other hand, the inflation expectations have also risen pretty dramatically. And so now we know that this is a season of turbulence, if you will. And so what is important here is, obviously, we saw when tariffs were a number of different rounds of tariffs were imposed and then paused. We saw the market collapse, and then we saw the market surge. And so all I'm saying is that there's more to the story. This is just one chapter in that story, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind. That said, there are a series of economic headwinds. And so higher tariffs obviously are weighing on consumer psyche. It's driving down consumer confidence. And so lower corporate confidence as well. And so I can assure you, we'll get into more detail here, but many decisions have been delayed in terms of CapEx. Businesses don't know how to respond. And so in light of this uncertainty, this is contributing to in some ways, a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, or ultimately uncertainty breeds a delay, right? And this is ultimately what we're seeing. Obviously, negative wealth effects is folks are looking at their 401ks and the like, and so this is also a factor. Now, housing has actually been quite robust and remained quite strong, but that's a small point in a broad range of different factors here. So what is that contributing to? Well, here as of February, once again, we see a pretty significant fall off in CapEx plans, and so a wide range of different sources here, but ultimately meaningful declines. And so again, we'll get into even more granularity here with some of our survey work. So if we look at the supplier barometer, again, this goes out to our members, and we've been doing this for many years, and so there's a lot of transparency. I'll say all responses are anonymized, but what's important is we ask our members, hey, over the next 12 months, how is your outlook, and how has it changed over the past quarter? And if we look to the left, there is a breakout there, just so you know, there's a distinction between light vehicle and commercial vehicle. But at the end of the day, the chart on the right shows that 29 is the measure that came away here in the first quarter of 25. And you might say, well, what does 29 mean? Well, 50 is neutral. And so this means that our members are decidedly pessimistic. They are very concerned because, once again, tariffs, costs, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pressure here. And so we saw a 7-point decline from the prior quarter at the end of last year. And so that's a meaningful decline there. But let's jump into some of the rationale as to why that is. The other point before I change slides here, this is actually the 12th consecutive quarter of building pessimism. And so that means for 3 years in a row, we've asked, how's your 12-month outlook? And how has it changed since the prior? Have you become more optimistic or more pessimistic? And so for 12 quarters in a row, our members have said, we're more negative, we're more pessimistic as a result of the landscape that we're facing. So what are the greatest threats to the industry here over the next 12 months? Number one, changes in government trade policy. And so this has everything to do with tariffs and in a number of different schemes, or a wide range of tariffs as they're laid out here. Now, this is absolutely this is a collapse. If to go from 4.5 in November in the fourth quarter last year to 2.3, this is a fundamental shift. Obviously, this represents a tremendous amount of concern. If we look at the percentage there, this is on a 10-point scale. Number one being the greatest threat. 55% of respondents indicated it was a 1. And so very, very large cause for concern. So number two, poor sales of programs supplied. You've got to remember, over the past 24 months especially, many programs launched, many EV programs launched, and a number of other programs as well, but EVs in particular. And we saw a significant underperformance across the board on a number of programs. And so as a result, suppliers are like, well, wait a minute. We bid on this project. We bid on this program for this volume, and we're at a fraction. We might be at 75%. Some programs at 50% or as low as 30% of plan. And so this means we've invested capacity. We've invested in capacity, and yet we're at a fraction of volume. And this represents a huge headwind. And so, and it also means that for that program, that means, financial loss in many cases, right? Additionally, then weakness in the U.S. economy. Now, again, we ended last year with a pretty robust expectation, pretty strong levels of growth. And yet, obviously, again, we're in this season of turbulence, as I mentioned. Finally, then the fourth point here, implementation of new government regs, also another factor, but again, not maybe as severe as the last. So I want to highlight here just quickly industry indicators, and this is important because for the following indicators, what have you seen? What indicate what change, if any, your company has experienced over the following time frames? And so what's important is that on the left is total industry, and you have a 12-month change and a 1-month change. And so if you look at new orders, again, 50 being neutral, it means that new orders on a 12-month basis is net negative 17. Okay, that's not great. On a 1-month change, it's still negative. It's improving. It's not as low as 33, but it's still 42, which means 8 points negative. Okay, so not a good situation there. So effectively, there's a lot of pessimism. If we look at production, 29 on a 12-month change, 36 on a 1-month change. So again, new orders are down, production is down. And now, if we look at costs, again, 50 being neutral, 83 on a 12-month change simply means my costs are still, meaningfully higher, 33 points higher than a neutral reading. And on a 1-month basis, okay, those costs maybe aren't as rising as high as they used to be, but they're still elevated. And so 77 into 27 points above neutral. Again, so here we are, we're faced with, lower orders, lower production, and higher costs. And so this is the challenge that the supplier industry is facing, and certainly, many of the automakers as well. All right, so this is everything right here. Okay, we can talk about electrification. We can talk about how great it is. And in many cases, these vehicles are very strong and they're very good performers. However, if they're performing well below plan, this is a money-losing proposition for the automaker and for suppliers. And so if we look here, how concerned is your company about the risk of stranded capital due to underperforming programs and regulatory impacts over the following timeframes? Well, if you look back over the past 12 months, and then looking at total industry, it's 32% of respondents indicate that it's either a substantial concern or it's the utmost concern. Okay, but going forward, looking at the next 12 months, this is even far more, far more acute. 58% of respondents indicate that it's either a substantial concern or the utmost concern. And so this simply means that there are many programs that are underperforming, and that this represents a significant financial burden for the supplier community. And so, again, kind of pointing out the obvious, but that means that tariffs couldn't come at a worse time, for the supplier community and for the industry as a whole. So, to highlight that even more, if we look at light vehicle, the industry outlook and break even. Okay, we ask our members, where is break even for you? Okay, so if we look at the S&P Global Mobility, the sales forecast, historically, that's the red line there. And then what we do is we ask our members, okay, so where's your production now, your expected production level, and where is your break even? And so fortunately, last year or this year, we're kind of in a very similar path, and so there's 1.4 million units of additional buffer. So production levels are 1.4 million units higher than break even, but not so fast. Unfortunately, tariffs have created a very, very difficult environment for the industry, and so as a result, there are very real concerns that it's contributing to, again, weakness in the economy to the point that consumers are concerned that they're delaying purchases. And so we know our friends at Cox have revised lower their U.S. outlook here for light vehicle demand, and S&P has also revised lower their production forecast for North America here this year and for the next couple of years. And so what does this mean? It means break even is still 14 million units, and yet the reality is that now we're looking at a 13.9 to 14.3 million unit environment, which means that the industry is really kind of on the bubble in terms of whether they're going to be making money this year or not. Now, obviously, there are many suppliers that are very profitable and very strong, and they're leveraging their agility and their innovation and to take advantage of a very volatile environment. But that said, if we look in this 13.9 to 14.3 million unit environment for this year, that's a significant headwind. But then also, moreover, that's maintained. Instead of in a 15.3 million unit environment for 2026, we're looking at about another million unit reduction for next year, and effectively from 15.5 in 27 to so about a 500,000 unit reduction there for 2027. And so again, I simply highlight this because tariffs again are certainly the backdrop, and there's more to cover here, but this is represents a significant headwind, and ultimately the volume of the industry, the economies of scale, and the production volume that is supporting the industry on these various programs are what contribute then to profitability and to the ability for suppliers and manufacturers to continue to invest and to be resilient here. So with that, we ask another question here in our first quarter barometer. We ask over the next 12 months, what are the following external issues that you'll face as you meet required levels of production? And so this is a key point of concern for us. And just so you know, we have a great team in Washington, D.C., and we're all about making sure that we are a resource. We mentioned that we work with the administration, we work with policymakers and regulators, and we are sharing this kind of information to make sure they understand, listen, this is a really, really important element. And so this is, we've already hosted nearly 50 meetings with members of on the Hill. We've met with members of the administration, and this is certainly our purpose, one of a critical role that we play in doing this. And so, looking at sub-tier supplier, sub-tier financial distress, the concern here is that it doesn't take many suppliers to become insolvent to derail the industry. And so we saw this, during, the last number of years, and this is certainly a very significant factor. 16% of respondents indicating that this is on a 5-point scale, this is a very severe issue. And so this is critical, and it, again, is a key issue that we continue to track and to monitor. Other factors here as well, supply chain constraints and disruptions. Clearly this is an important one. And if we think about it, so just for reference, about 2/3 of our members are smaller members. And so, around, they're obviously, the largest are tens of billions of dollars in terms of annual revenue. The smaller firms can be anywhere from, $200 million to $10 million. And so these organizations don't have the same level of resources, and so this is another critical role that we provide. So if we continue on here, looking at research and development, historically, research and development contributed, the median value contributed about 3% of total sales, R&D. And this is important because, again, right now, in light of tariffs, there are many suppliers that say, well, wait a minute, I've already invested to support programs that are already on the books. And so now I'm in a very, very difficult situation to try and reallocate or, the sourcing of programs and at incremental cost and the like. If we look then here in the center, we see R&D budget. It's broken out there. Research budget for future technologies versus development budget, which is for specific programs. But it remains very robust here in 2025. 30% is the median value. It simply means that suppliers remain focused on innovation. So this is very positive. So an important one here, even in light of the pressures relative to tariffs. All right, so a quick one here. If we look at R&D development, yes, R&D technology investment. And so if you had additional dollars for R&D investment in terms of importance, how would you allocate it across the following technology areas? And so the interesting one here is that, again, continued focus in advanced materials. And so we know that electrification, there's maybe, again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Ultimately, electrification is a very important, and it will be a very critical technology for the industry. But it's going to continue to be, it's going to coexist within a portfolio of technologies. If we look here as well, looking at Industry 4.0, connected manufacturing, another significant focus here, and then as well a broader range of technologies across on the powertrain side. All right, so with that, let me just continue on here. How am I doing on time? If we look at one of the key things that we've heard from, we know the administration is very, very bullish and very aggressively saying, hey, look, we need you to localize here. And at the end of the day, we know that it's very challenging for our members to find talent. This is actually our fourth quarter barometer and on talent and HR. And we asked, estimate your year to date, 2024 in November, monthly voluntary turnover rates for hourly personnel. And so the average in the U.S. on hourly turnover was 7.5% on a monthly basis, right? Monthly turnover. So what's remarkable here as well is if you look at the bright red, there are 7% that is between 10 and 15. There's 10% of respondents indicate that their monthly turnover is between 15 and 20%. And then 6% indicate that it's more than 20% on a monthly basis. That's brutal. this represents a huge cost and a huge headwind. And so so in light of, this idea that we can localize, of course, the idea of onshoring and bolstering our shortening supply chains is important, but it's also very challenging given this backdrop here relative to pockets of talent within the U.S. in particular, but it also is very true here in Mexico as well. So if we look at labor acquisition, based on current open requisitions, rate each of the following job classifications and positions where you have HR shortages. Number one, hourly skilled trades. So 35% of respondents indicate this is a number one. This is on a 5-point scale. This is crucial. And so these are exactly the kinds of skilled workers that would be needed to shift production to onshore production. And so it represents a meaningful headwind here that makes it difficult. Technicians as well, engineering as well, also factors. If we look at filling open positions, based on current open recs rate, so what's prohibiting you from finding sufficient talent? And what's remarkable here is, number one, lack of qualified candidates. 32% of respondents indicate that's number one. Number two, competition from other industry sectors. And so this is very real. We know that, certainly on the software side, software is demanded everywhere. And so it makes it even more challenging as we continue to move ahead. But obviously, there are a number of different factors here as well. Wages, another factor. So a shout out to our friends here at CAR, but ultimately looking at, these factors in the context then of investment, suppliers have already made massive investments to the tune of in excess of $50 billion here in 2022 and 2023, obviously helped in large part, with the IRA, as well as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so really, really important, but this also means, okay, so how is this going to be leveraged? How are we going to see a return on the $156 billion of investment already announced? And so this is from the book of deals here. So important factor just to put into context. So with that, also if we look, right now, one of the big challenges is that, and part of the rationale I understand with S&P revising down their production forecast, is that, look, costs are through the roof. And so if pricing, average transaction prices are at historic highs, consumers are already struggling with affordability on a number of different areas. Now, of course, look, if you need to get to work, you need to get to work. But this represents another headwind. And so this is a significant factor here as, estimated, monthly transaction prices here, near that $50,000 threshold, courtesy of our friends at Kelley Blue Book. So, looking then here as well, last year, where's the growth come from? Well, affordability is really what is crucial. And so as much as we can talk about, preferences, consumers have preferences. And so what's important, clearly we see affordability, MSRP here, the average in 2024, under $34,000, significant gains in these categories, while mid SUV, mid car, and full-size truck came under some pressure. And so some declines there in that space as a result of significantly higher MSRPs. And so important there to put into perspective as well. All right, so key takeaways, just want to wrap up with a couple points. We've done, we're probably on our sixth survey of our members, looking at tariffs in particular, and there's a lot of granular information. And the point is, though, is that our members trust us, and that's, it's important. We leverage that. We use that, for our discussions here with the administration and with policymakers, regulators, and the rest. The quick point here is looking at sub-tier supplier distress. Look, we know it's real, it's out there, it's a very significant concern. If we look at financial health, there's actually probably a concerning number of suppliers that are showing some very, some risk in terms of revenue, in terms of profitability, in terms of cash flow. And so this is another factor, right? If we look at available capacity, Available capacity, many of our members are saying, listen, we don't have it. Like, it's just not here. Now, if we were to invest, could we find some, procure some? Sure. But then you're spending double the investment, right? For, a single program. That represents a significant, headwind in terms of viability, profitability for a given program. And then also in terms of timing is also a challenge, right? There's an expectation. Well, can't you just make that happen within a 6-month window? Well, actually, it's there are some instances where that could be accelerated, but it's also much more challenging than that, and typically it requires a much longer lead time. Looking at given the cost situation that's out there, what efforts are you taking to reduce your SG&A? Well, many of our members, significant tens of percentages, they're delaying investment, they're delaying CapEx because they don't know what's viable, and so that represents a significant headwind here as well. Tariff impact on earnings, our members indicate that look, it's a little bit too early to tell, but will there be an impact? Absolutely, a negative one at that. But right now, that's expected to show more in the second quarter here. And so that's an important point here. But the other point then as well is that in light of headwinds, in light of the volatility, there's demand destruction. And so we're seeing lower overall volumes on a production basis, on a demand basis. So that contributes and cascades down. So, what are the headwinds then for lending institutions? Are they willing to provide access to capital? And to what extent are suppliers able to secure capital? And have you already tapped into available funds? And do you need to here in the near term? Investment decisions here since tariffs have been announced, or what's it look like here 12 months from now? And so there's an expectation. Okay, there may be some marginal upside, but right now it's too early to tell. Most of our members they're concerned, and they can't make an informed decision with only half of the information. And so this is largely what is coming across. Tariff cost impacts, it's real. And so you're looking at, upwards of, looking at certainly a very material cost of your finished, your finished good as a result of these tariff impacts. So localization plans, clearly there are some suppliers that are, okay, look, we can pursue it. We're interested, this kind of thing, but it's a very challenging, relative to timeline. And so looking at USMCA is very important, and compliance is also a significant factor. And so there are many cases where, compliance wasn't required. There was no duty. And so it didn't matter. But now, as a result, their suppliers are pursuing compliance in a very aggressive fashion. But even there's many months, in some cases, more than a year before USMCA compliance can be attained. And so this is another reality. Looking here then as well across the board, the lion's share of cost impact is coming from reciprocal tariffs, IEEPA tariffs, and tariffs on autos and select auto parts, as far as where that expectation is in terms of the impact for suppliers. Additionally, then looking at steel imports and derivatives, aluminum imports and derivatives, those are also factors, but a bit more nominal in terms of the overall impact. Just one more slide here, if I could. Just looking at overall competitiveness. Here's the reality. We've asked our members, what's the impact of tariffs on your company's competitiveness here in North America? And they come back and they said, look, at the end of the day, we're much less competitive. 40% of members, indicate, 35% say slightly less. Okay, so that's 75% saying tariffs are a significant headwind for us. This represents a significant hurdle. Now, again, it's a season. We're in the season of turbulence, if you will. On a global basis, it's a very similar story, 69%. So it's not as severe, but again, we're in a global industry, and so it's very important for our members, to make sure that we're sharing this message, with the administration, with regulators and the like to ensure that, and with customers as well. Certainly, we've been working with each of the OEMs, ensuring that we're sharing, information so that everyone is informed, so that we can be strong partners to help support a constructive solution. So with that, appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. Guido, are you with us? Are you with us, Guido?
Ready to go, Bruce.
Okay. If you want to join in on this Q&A, feel free to do so. I think some of the stuff that Mike was talking about you'll be talking about it as well. Well, we had a presentation which was a pretty a down presentation on the environment just before Mike's presentation, and then I think this is not a very positive presentation about how the supplier industry is seeing the current administration, because in the end, this conference is about the effects of the new administration, right? So, Mike, one of the things that struck me is the administration actually renegotiating the USMCA as a whole, or only as from a tariff perspective?
Well, I think it's a fair question. I mean, ultimately, that's still being determined as we speak, right? But I think at the end of the day, our members have made it very clear that USMCA is vital. It's absolutely crucial for the industry and for our competitiveness here in North America. And I think what's interesting is, I would say, let's go back to a year ago. A year ago, the situation was very different, okay? Because a different administration, and there were, it was very, clearly understood that BYD would build a factory in Mexico, and they would all of a sudden have a very strong footprint here in North America that could then compete, whether one would argue fairly or unfairly, with other OEMs and suppliers, with their supply chains here in North America. And so we're in a very different situation a year later. And so I think this is really kind of like the context for, what we've seen is that, a wide range of tariffs have come forward. And yet we've also seen a significant shift where, China is much more in focus than what was initially, than the initial premise. And so I think, again, at the end of the day, I do believe that the administration does support a very strong automotive industry and supplier community. And so, there may be some differences on how to get there. But I think that's ultimately where they're looking to go.
Mike, do you have anything else? Guido, do you have anything you want to add on that?
All set, Bruce.
Okay. Now, Mike, the USMCA has been in effect for about 5 years, yet only 63% of motor vehicle parts from Mexico meet USMCA compliance, and 74% from Canada are compliant. Why is that? Well,
It's a good question. I don't have a very concrete answer for you, but what I can say is that there are a number of different factors, a number of different components where it simply didn't need to be, they're not compliant. Now, the part of it is that there are a number of different components within the supply chain that are sourced simply outside of, that aren't available here. And so that's one factor. So, the content is not available. Two, there are other areas where, they've specialized, and so there are supply chains that are established, and so that are, either come from other sources in Asia that are not compliant. And so as a result, that's another factor there as well. But so those are a couple of reasons there. But I also believe that we know that there is a meaningful amount of content that was not compliant or simply did not, they didn't pursue compliance, and yet ultimately will qualify for it. And so we're seeing a meaningful, increase there as well.
Very good. Thank you. One of the questions we talked about earlier in the conference had to do with tariff stacking. Now, aren't suppliers' parts going to cross the ones that cross international borders multiple times, leading to multiple tariff applications, including reciprocals, in the tariff stacking story? How are your suppliers talking about this?
It's a great question, and there's quite a bit. I mean, look, it's a reality. There are some of our members that they have components and materials that cross the border 5, 6, 7 times or more, and so it's very real. Again, there are a number of different factors to it. This is clearly represents a significant headwind, significant cost. It's something that is we're making sure that we share this kind of information with the administration, just so that they do understand and recognize and know that. So just to make sure that we, because our biggest concern is that, we've talked about, I mentioned it a number of different times, as far as sub-tier supplier distress and the financial burden on the supplier sector. And so if there are some that were to become insolvent, that just contributes to we want to avoid contagion. We want to avoid that type of risk. And so this is an important element that we're sharing.
Huge issue, I think, for the supply base. Now, the Center for Strategic International Studies recently noted that companies may well prefer to diversify their supply chains away from the United States altogether and, quote, only face the cost of a tariff for a fully assembled automobile, rather than face multiple tariffs for multiple parts coming into the United States. Do you see that as a possibility?
I mean, it's a fair question, but I think it's a hypothetical, right? I mean, it's like I said, I think it's difficult to come away with a conclusion that and we already know, right, that based on the surveys that we've been doing and the feedback that we already have, is that nobody's making a definitive decision here with incomplete information, relative to changing supply chains and abandoning markets and the like, right? It's obviously that would be premature and unwise. That said, obviously it's not easy, but I do think that look, we know that our members they're looking very diligently. They're spanning. They're looking. They're assessing their supply chains in dramatic fashion and looking very carefully at what's feasible and working within the constraints. I mean, look, at the end of the day, what it comes back to is competitiveness and competitiveness beyond a 4-year window, right? This is the challenge. One could argue that many suppliers, many automakers were very well positioned to be successful in the prior administration. And then we changed administrations, and all of a sudden we're in a very different situation and a difficult one at that. And so, as an industry, it's very important to make sure and to support policies that will endure beyond a 4-year window, so that we're not constantly, trying to steer the ship in a very dramatic fashion every 4 years.
Mike, you have anything you want to add?
No.
Okay. One of the things that he talked about, Mike, was the reshoring, and if an automaker, and you can talk about this from a supply base as well, and Mike, you can talk about it from automakers if you want. If they were to build a new plant in the U.S., how long would it take, and how much would it cost? One estimate was 19 to 32 months. Does that sound about right?
I would say that, again, part of it is, there are some organizations that have moved very quickly and have done so probably, more quickly than that. Again, part of it is supply chain, whether it's, EV facility versus a broader range of technologies. And so that's another factor. But, cost-wise, I mean, again, it runs the gamut. I would say on the ICE side, you're probably, $1 billion is kind of like, a starting point. And an 18-month window, I would say, is kind of a minimum. And so that's, kind of a reality there. But again, I think, we've seen some very, very innovative, very aggressive, actions on the part of some players that have been very successful. And so, again, I think what's interesting, though, too, is the other point then, as I would say, is there have been instances where suppliers and automakers have been able to, move a line or move, production of a component or system in a shorter window of time. And so maybe a little bit of a tangential answer, but this one's also a reality where, the administration in some cases is saying, look, 6 months is kind of the window that we want you to try and source within this time frame. Things can be done more quickly, but it requires a very, very high degree of collaboration with, OE and customer. And so, again, and that's kind of on a case-by-case basis. Yeah.
Agree with what Mike said. I just thought here is that decisions aren't made just based on today's politics. I mean, all this stuff is long-term thinking. I mean, the companies have to look beyond just what this administration is doing and try to figure out where they want to be and what assets they need where globally in the long term too. So it's not just the money, it's not just today's tariffs, but a number of factors go into all of these decisions about where to build a plant, when to build a plant, how to build a plant, what to move around, and where to put it.
Guido, do you have anything you want to add on that one?
I'll expand further during the presentation, Bruce.
No problem. No problem. Mike, how much automation can you expect for new automotive plants in the U.S. to reduce the labor costs going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question because, certainly automation is a big factor. We know that, the automotive facility, supplier facility, and the automaker facility of today is very different than it was even just, 5 or 10 years ago. And so automation's a big factor. It doesn't mean that there won't be jobs. What it means is that the kind of work that's being done can be modified and to benefit, the workforce. And so what's important is there's no question that automation is critical, repeatability, reducing burden, again, of course, reducing cost, that's part of the effort as well. And so it's a significant factor. Automation is probably one of the top, areas. We've asked about innovation. We've asked about AI, and it's clearly a focus because one of the challenges, as I highlighted here, is within the labor force. It's been challenging to have to maintain a stable workforce, like level loading, right? And so if you train everybody up and your EV volume doesn't come to fruition, well, then you've got extra staff. And so then you have to try and reallocate them and this kind of thing, right? So this is reality. So the point is, automation is going to be an incredibly important role, again, working in tandem with the workforce.
Very good, Mike. All right, we're letting you off the hook.
All right, perfect.
Thank you very much. Last speaker, Guido Vildoso is the Associate Director of Automotive Consulting at S&P Global Mobility, as a leader within the S&P Global Mobility Consulting practice, specializing in providing executive level strategic insights and solutions to automotive clients. He brings more than 20 years of experience at S&P Global. Guido has vast experience in electrification, product planning and strategy and production and capacity utilization and import-export strategies. Previously serving as head of light vehicle sales and propulsion forecasts in the Americas based on regulations, pricing, OEM strategies, and infrastructure. He holds a bachelor's of economics and a master of international economics from Suffolk University in Boston, and has also pursued graduate studies in marketing, business, and finance at Bentley College in Waltham, Massachusetts. Welcome, Guido.
Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, everyone. Guido Vildoso, as Bruce just mentioned. I'm delighted to join you, even though it's virtually today, partly due to the fact that I can't move around too much, have eardrum issues, so I get motion sickness, and therefore home is where it's most comfortable. And my goal today is to build up on what our great presenters have already shared with you and continue poking the bear. I want to thank Bruce for this opportunity to be able to showcase some of our research with you, but also from a selfish standpoint, I don't want to be the guy that holds you back from lunch, and I do have a hard drop at 1. So I'll try to make sure that I share some of the content that we have over the next 25 minutes, and then we can tackle questions after that. So tariffs are here. The Trump administration is here. Welcome to this brave new world. And needless to say, we've been prepping for it, and we've been prepping for it for roughly about 1.5 years at S&P Global Mobility. Now, many of you, I assume, are clients or have seen some of our publications. And from that particular standpoint, let me start with our baseline. Our baseline is looking at roughly about a 15.4 million unit market for light vehicle sales this year, followed by roughly about 15 million units next year. So overall, a 600,000 unit downgrade for this year and a 1.2 million unit downgrade for the year after that, with that window starting to close beyond that, million units roughly for 27 and narrowing down to 500,000. And there are multiple moving pieces behind this. There's no one lever that we can look at and say, well, this is the absolute truth. We can start from a macro perspective and the fact that higher for longer, so inflation and interest rates and financing, and this is a result of the impact that tariffs will have from an inflationary standpoint, and obviously we knew that the consumer was feeling the pain and affordability was coming around the corner. It's also very important to mention that we are at a crossroad, particularly as a result of electrification, and I won't dwell into the regulation, but the big takeaway here is there's cost to build, and obviously how much most OEMs are losing in some of their electric propositions, whether it's BEV, plug-in hybrid, or whatever the case may be, and what the consumer is willing to pay. So obviously those two are not in line, and needless to say, that's another challenge that we have overall at this point of time, and therefore it leads to financial strain. And then, of course, we got to move on to the lay of the land, or the law of the land. And needless to say, we'll find out what pertains in regards to MPG and GHG in just a little bit more. We know that IRA is going to be also looked at. We understand that USMCA is on the list, but let's deal with the one that we know for now, which is, of course, trade and tariff. And trade and tariff, the basic assumptions that we have at this point of time: 25% automotive, parts and components coming in a not so distant future in similar fashion. But let's merge that with what we are seeing on the consumer front. And on the consumer front, the message is crystal clear. This is not a good time to buy a car. If I can wait, I will. So the problem is we have a bunch of people that moved down south. So we moved away from areas where public transportation was very well defined into the new frontier, south of the Mason-Dixon, where public transportation is not available. And therefore, this need for private transportation is a requirement, and that's driving the market, but it's not necessarily the way we were seeing it before. High margin vehicles, Gladiator, COVID, in case the zombies come, I need that ultimate macho vehicle. No longer the case. Just a set of wheels to get me there and home. Great in that South Carolina summer where we're definitely going to need the AC. Now, the good news is we're starting to see some ease when it comes to vehicle financing, improving affordability somewhat. But in the grand scheme of things, we've essentially gone from being at roughly 4% in vehicle financing all the way up to 8%. And chances are that may continue to face headwinds over the coming months, as we are unlikely to see an easing on monetary policy, meaning the federal funds rate is likely to stay flattish for the foreseeable future, given the pressure that we're going to have as a result of tariffs. So needless to say, one of the alternatives that we're seeing from OEMs is, of course, they're starting to push leasing again. Now, consumers are smart and they're saying, I may just stick to loans because of the fact that vehicles are extremely or ridiculously expensive. I'm not going to pay $32,000 for a used car that is 3 years old and it's got 80,000 miles on it. So yes, we are seeing some movement when it comes to leasing, but it's constrained because the consumer is also understanding that residual is going to be a challenge further down the road. As far as baseline assumptions and what drove the forecast that you just saw, so let me just go back 2 slides. What is driving this 15.4 and 15 million units for this year, next year? And the big takeaway is, of course, tariffs at 25%, full on, no questions asked. So that is there until we can renegotiate USMCA, and we anticipate that at some point in time, early next year, particularly because of the financial pressures that we're going to have on car companies. Again, let's go back to where we started. Cost to build, willingness to pay. We're losing money for many of these electrified vehicles. So having to now lower that because of the fact that we're paying more for tariffs, that's going to be a pain point, and therefore we anticipate that there will be an understanding by the administration, and we'll see necessary responses coming in from DC. That being the case, we anticipate that USMCA moves to a new normal, which is roughly about 12%. You may say, well, why? We understand very clearly, MFN, most favored nation, won't stick around at 2.5 anymore. Clearly, with 2.5, you were able to find ways to build it in Mexico without having to be fully compliant. So clearly, the administration knows that they were very transparent about it. I want to quote the president: friend or foe, and sometimes friend has taken more. So if we use that as a barometer, we know that reset for USMCA, if it comes, will be at a higher price point, at a higher tariff rate. And that is in place here, where we assume that it's probably going to be closer to 12%. Some of the people we've spoken to have hinted at 10%. We also understand, and this is from a highly automated perspective, that the margin or the additional cost to build at an automated plant in the US coming in from Mexico is roughly about 15% higher. And that, of course, depends on the location and so on and so forth, but it gives you a barometer. And therefore, we can't be too far away from that, because at the end of the day, we are in a world of total resets. We're not assuming that this administration is joking, and it's becoming clear that automotive is one of the pillars that they want to move. So there's up to 5 potential different pillars, and automotive is one of them that is likely to go through a reset. So that from a USMCA perspective. Rest of the world, and because we still need allies out there in Europe and out there in the Far East, 15%. And obviously it could come in a little bit higher, but that more or less helps to explain why we start to move towards a 15.5 million unit market further down the road, as these pillars start to normalize, whether it's USMCA, whether it is rest of the world, and all of the different challenges that we're going to see, because it won't be as simple as that. Let's just talk about some of the pieces that we should be mindful of. Foreign entity of concern, ownership, software, hardware, none of that coming out from China. Then we got to look at MFN, possibly expanding the list of critical pillars that we have within automotive manufacturing. So all of that is coming in, and that basically summarizes the slide that you have seen right here. And this, of course, is a sequence to everything, including some of the slides that were coming from, or some of the tariffs that were coming from outside of that perspective. Now, let's assume for a split second that this is a total reset. This administration wasn't bluffing, and the 25% is here to stay. Okay, it's not going anywhere. So that forces us to now have to look at every single model. And when we're talking about model, it's not as simple as saying it's the 3 Series. No, it's the 3 Series. What sort of body type are we talking about? Where is it manufactured? And what are the components of that vehicle looking like? Why is that relevant? Because first and foremost, the tariff is going to be applied on CBUs. So it's essentially where the vehicle is coming in from. And there will be exceptions. I mean, we've seen that very clearly, vehicles coming in from Mexico and Canada, there won't be a tariff on US content. So needless to say, for those that are built in Mexico and Canada, we've got to look at how much was built in the US. So we got to look at those components, and our components and forecast analytics database has allowed us to do that. And we've decoded for every single model, as mentioned before, which is nameplate, propulsion system, origin of the vehicle. So we've decontented that to be able to analyze this a little bit better. And we've also factored in, even for US built vehicles, how much is coming in from Mexico and Canada, which again would have some degree of preferential treatment, and then rest of the world. And what is that effective tariff rate going to look like? So that takes us over to, obviously, where OEMs are going to, or could potentially discover their new price points are going to be. But those price points are not coming out of MSRP. And we have an MSRP on every single vehicle sold in the US via our registration database, our legacy Polk business. This is really coming out of CIF, so the cost of landing. And whether it's the cost of landing on parts or whether it's the cost of landing on the vehicle itself, that's where we need to find out what sort of exposure are we going to have. And obviously, we spent time on that and essentially decluttering what makes up every vehicle, what is that cost of landing. And now that we've understood how much of a tariff we need to put on it, let's look at our competitors, because some of them are built in the US. So they're going to have a natural advantage. And I'll give you a few examples of some of the work that we have done. But overall, the big takeaway here is, when we're looking at effective tariff rates, and particularly if we don't see any changes to what has already been announced, then of course, most vehicles that are US assembled would be paying a 5 to 7% tariff. And obviously, there are exceptions to that. There are non-compliant vehicles, and we won't point out who that is, but just to put them out there. Vehicles coming in from Canada and Mexico, 14 to 18%. Again, depending on what the components are behind those vehicles. And last but not least, 20%. And you may say, whoa. Stop right there. Isn't the tariff 25%? Yes, it is. But why is that effective tariff rate lower? It's going to come out of margins. So we spent time talking to some of the OEMs, and needless to say, depending on what the origin of the vehicle is, you have some more degree of flexibility to play around with that. But we understand very clearly that adjustments need to happen from a business perspective. And this is why we call it a total reset, because it goes beyond having to figure out plant locations. The business itself is likely to change. And that is, of course, complemented with fluctuations that we may see in exchange rates. So needless to say, and so far we've been proven wrong here on this one. We anticipated there would be a devaluation on currencies. What we've seen so far is an appreciation of currencies. But if you start to grab all of those moving pieces, an effective tariff rate because of the composition of the vehicle, a dilution of margins, and then, of course, FX, that takes us out to saying, okay, in a pre-tariff world, we were sitting at roughly about $45,914, for a average MSRP. And again, this is MSRP, not transaction prices. If we implement all of these things across the board from a weighted average perspective, our new MSRP should be at roughly about $50,300. Now, it's not as simple as that because obviously we've got model year changeover adjustments that we have to account for, and those range between 1,200 to 1,800 at this moment of time. So, needless to say, the actual MSRP may actually be higher than that, but let's just assume that this is where we end up at. And if we were to do that, last year we closed at 16 million units. Where would that take us in the 2026? Low 14s. And I think Mike did a great job at factoring in, we're already very close to a break-even point. What does this total reset look like? But the goal here is, not to scare you, because as mentioned earlier, tariffs are here. We knew they were coming, and it's definitely a challenge, but there are opportunities that we can look at and basically maximize over the coming years. Where should we not be looking? Well, entry side of the market. Yes, the consumer wants affordable vehicles. Most of those are imported. And the fact is, if you look at subcompact today, average vehicle price roughly about 17,000. The effective tariff would be roughly about 20%. So that would take us all the way out to $23,000. You can see at $23,000, segment is gone. We don't have any more offerings for the subcompact segment. It's a similar storyline for compact car as well as compact pickup. We do have one exception right there in compact car, but then that's when we got to start to look at capacity. And at least for that particular OEM, there's not a lot of capacity coming into place when you're looking at that vehicle. So yes, they have an opportunity, but they're constrained when it comes to capacity. And this is really what this new world looks like, where you got to analyze it on a case-by-case basis. It's not as simple as saying the overall market will do this, and this is going to be the new MSRP, and that's where the opportunity lies. The other element is how, the elephant in the room, how is the consumer, how is Joe Smith going to respond to this? Because essentially, there's one response for compact car, but there's also a lot of sensitivity for one of our key segments, which is full-size pickup. Many of those buyers are fleet buyers. There's not a lot of flexibility when it comes to pricing behind that segment. So needless to say, single digits, tolerable, there's not a lot of impact. But the moment we start to cross into double digit, we start to see how this exponentially gets worse. And these are some of the challenges that we have to start to look at and basically decode what each of our client base is like to be able to decide on how we're going to be able to tackle this. Because if you're on the supplier side of the business, you're going to get calls very, very soon trying to figure out how much you can help out with this. And let's look at a very concrete example. Let's talk about the compact utility segment, bread and butter to the US. And when we're looking at that, out of the top 15 selling vehicles, 6 of them are built in the US. Now, some of them have more US content relative to others, but nonetheless, they have an advantage, meaning for most of these guys, they probably could jack up their prices to as high as 11%, gain momentum, and not have to worry about anything. But this other half of the equation that is being imported, and some of them being imported from Canada and Mexico and other parts around the world, there's exposure. There's clear exposure to that. So this is the balancing act of this brave new world that we have to look at. And, it magnifies because now it's not only about the segment, it's looking at the OEMs. And obviously, what this chart tells you is this is the overall volume relative to how much is built in the US. And it helps you to start to identify where the pain points are, but also where the opportunities lie. And, we can focus on the premium side of the business where we would assume, well, I don't have to worry much about that because they're affluent customers. Not necessarily true. There's a lot of sensitivity on these vehicles because they're leased. 60% of the German premium brands, those vehicles are leased. So there's obviously a certain degree of exposure right there, and needless to say, adjustments that are needed to be able to protect the loss of volume that we are going to see. Let's look at it from a different metric. Let's start to look at it from a margin perspective. And now we're war rooming this out. We got to figure out what we're going to do. And I'm focusing primarily on some of the most sensitive segments, and compact car is another good example. The effective average tariff for compact car is roughly about 16%. Average price, MSRP, 25,350. Now, that would mean that I would have to increase prices roughly about 14% based upon cost of landing. That translates into an increase of roughly about $3,600. Let's go back. If we start to look at that line and we suddenly go up $3,600, we've lost most of the segment. We can't do that. That's not an option. So then we got to start to look at what some of the other players are going to do in the segment. As mentioned earlier, there's one that is built locally, and we got to reel that in. We got to contain that price increase, and we assume that most OEMs are going to do that, 10%. So that's only a $2,600 increase, takes us out to roughly about 28,000. But we're going to lose roughly about 14% of the volume to the segment. And the margins are going to change. So for some of the vehicles, we're seeing a margin of roughly about $1,100 on a compact car. That goes down to $358. Now, that's average. Median is a completely different story. And we do have some players that are coming in, and today they're making $300 per unit in this segment. So they don't have the wiggle room to be able to do this. So this is the brave new world that we're dealing with. It's not as simple as saying, I need to just relocate to the US. It's a declutter of what is the build of the vehicle, and now also having to look at the margins to determine where we're going to go. So if you want to find those opportunities, we're here to help. Hopefully we've made a good description of what are some of the market challenges that we have. You understood our methodology on how we are starting to look at this from multiple different perspectives and looking at, what is the content of the vehicle? What is the effective tariff rate? Can we play around with effects and margins, and where are we going to land in regards to volume? And needless to say, this is a solution that we believe would be practical to both OEMs and suppliers. So from that particular standpoint, then my colleague, Mike Kamarin is there. Mike, if you don't mind standing up and sort of doing a wave right there. And if you have any questions, Mike is more than happy to take your business card and follow up from there. So I'll stop right there. And like I said, the goal today is not to scare you, but to help you find those opportunities. Bruce, happy to take any questions that we have them.
Thank you very much, Guido. U.S. buyers, 70% US SUVs and pickup trucks. How does that fit into the lower price models?
So that's a great question, and let's split it out. We understand that there's a preference on the light truck passenger car mix at this point of time. But again, let's look at what we are seeing. We're seeing a population shift from north to south. If your only option is having to get to work, there's an opportunity here, clear opportunity for the entry side of the business, which is compact car, again, for those that assemble in the US. And we may see a shift back towards passenger cars as a result of that. Now, that's only the entry side of the business. We're not necessarily saying this is a return for passenger car. Those two-door coupes, the mid-size sedan, possibly gone for good. But, compact cars definitely there, could potentially grow. And that could create a distortion where we may see a recovery for passenger cars over the coming years. The big takeaway here is 50% of the market moves below an MSRP of roughly about 37,000. So that's really what we're dealing with is if monthly payment is the top concern, 37,000 is that magic number, and we need to be below that. Not many compact utilities are going to be able to be below that threshold, at least imported at this point in time.
Very interesting. It makes you wonder whether they, if there's going to be kind of a consumer revolt against this, because they're used to buying these type of vehicles, right? And you're saying, oh no, you got to change this now. You go, I don't know if they're going to be excited about this. When you look at the tariff story, we talked a little bit about the tariff stacking. Is that involved in your models?
To a certain extent, it is. So we haven't, done a stacking of all 14 different times for seatbelt components. or I think it's 5 for some of the engine components that we have between coating, components coming back and forth, and so on and so forth. But we've certainly factored in, and that's a great question. We've factored in aluminum and steel. We've looked at endpoint for the component, so not necessarily all of the pieces that make up an engine, but endpoint for that engine, endpoint for that transmission. And we factored that into what we were looking at. We had to move quickly. We do have the capacity to be able to trace all of this back and forth. But at this point in time, we needed to make sure that we communicated the sense of urgency behind this rather than give you a scientific deep dive that Elon Musk would sign off on.
Very good. In the past, some companies have been able to lobby for tariff exemptions. Do you see this happening this time?
It's part of the rationale behind our baseline assumption of a 12% for Canada and Mexico and 15% for the rest of the world. We anticipate that there will be a ongoing display of investments to be announced at the White House in a not so distant future by the OEMs, and that is going to lead to some of these preferential agreements. However, they won't be. This is not a situation where it's going to be a USMCA 2. This is really a reset because let's start to go back to the fact that for an automated plant, Mexico still leads if that price increase is contained to 15%. And therefore, the administration knows that, and that is really the benchmark that they're going to use because at the end of the day, automotive has been identified as one of the key pillars. And I'm not saying that we have enough people. A total agreement with Mike right there in regards to, does it make sense to pay $84,000 to a forklift operator down in the great state of Georgia? Possibly no, and they want to work from home one day. So unlikely, but nonetheless, this is what the administration wants to do, law of the land, and let's work along those lines and reset and start to talk about what that would look like.
Okay. As consumers shift towards cost consciousness, what is the trend for used cars in the U.S.?
Phenomenal question. Ongoing pressure, no questions asked, and we need to be closer to 15 million units. Let's start to think about the fact that the average vehicle age is quickly approaching 13 years. And many of these vehicles are now 4 cylinders. We don't have the classics. We don't have the V8s. We don't have the V6s anymore. So obviously the strain on those vehicles is going to be much, much higher. And therefore, the pressure on the used car side of the business is likely to increase. So there's no question about the fact that will also, used car prices will also go up. To what extent, that's harder to say at this point in time.
Now, as you know from we had a bunch of scenarios that I talked about earlier in the conference. Do you see the manufacturers having any leverage in tariff negotiations with the administration?
Let's put this into perspective. And I don't want to speak to the OEMs themselves. I think that's left to the trade associations, but we can certainly refer to some of the facts that we've seen over the last few weeks and the interaction between Elon Musk and Peter Navarro, where we've seen the back and forth in regards to his thoughts on tariffs. And we've got one of our key cabinet members, if you so wish to call it, pointing or highlighting what the severity of tariffs is like, and we haven't seen a shift on that. So that speaks to one of the reasons why we're leaning in this direction. And unlike previous times where we would have said, oh, it's just a bargaining technique, and they'll settle at a lower price point. That lower price point now means 15%. Again, thinking about the fact that from Mexico to the US, 15% cheaper, and therefore that's the threshold that you want to use. Whether or not we have enough people, that's a different story, but those are some of the different moving pieces that we have at this point in time.
Yeah, it says one of the questions here, it says, reports say some companies are compiling lists of parts that they're going to try to get exemptions for from the administration. Do you see that as a possibility?
Let's refer to Mexico, and let's use some of the numbers that we have. You know, we know that more than half of what's coming in from Mexico at this point in time is not USMCA compliant. Let's put a number behind that half. 45,000 parts. You know, 400 million every day, 45,000 parts. How quickly can we move through that from a paperwork standpoint? And you know, these are the things that we've got to be mindful of as we're navigating the waters.
Going back to the movement to adoption of small vehicles, do you have any suggestions for the ways that the industry can increase the interest in that movement?
I think we've already begun to see some of that momentum. It's just called a subcompact crossover at this point in time, and it's really you know, a hatchback on steroids. And some of those vehicles are selling very well. It is one of the growing segments of the industry. We've got multiple players, and I don't want to call out any particular nameplates here. But that's where some of the momentum is taking place. The question is, can we build that segment profitably in the US at this point of time? And bearing in mind that, you know, there are no subcompact crossovers that are built in the US today. There are some subcompact crossovers that are built in North America today, but not in the US. And that's where we see that compact car has an advantage, because at least one model is currently built, and we know that there's a second one that could potentially come in. So therefore, the capacity to be able to deploy that is a lot easier than you would on subcompact crossover.
Yeah, you were saying that the subcompact or the compact SUV is really price-wise not going to be able to make that jump, even though it's the biggest selling segment in the world.
Correct.
Yeah, very good. All right, Guido, you got at 1 o'clock. I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. Great presentation.
Thank you, everyone. Wish everyone well throughout this time period. Please feel free to reach out. I hope you've identified Mike, Bruce. Thank you for having us. All the best. We'll catch you soon. Bye now.
All right, take care. All right, we're going to close it off. Now, first of all, I want to thank everybody who participated today. We want to thank our speakers. I want to thank our affiliates for funding our conferences, and thanking our conference sponsor for this particular one, S&P Global Mobility. Upcoming conference, 17th Annual Propulsion Strategies for the 21st Century Conference. As you can tell from the title here, now what? Manufacturer and supplier propulsion strategies. Kind of a nice follow-up to this conference, because now we're going to be talking a little more detail about what's going on powertrain-wise. Again, thank everyone for attending, and hopefully see you in July. Take care.